trailed over to the truck. Seemed like the keys were still in it, so maybe they could drive the truck through the shutter doors. It could work, but then again, he'd have no idea until he crashed the truck. Plus if it did he could get a lot of people killed, so that was another dead end. But he was getting somewhere, he could feel it. Bustin' backquote down the door and beating da shit out all them punks, getting backquote in a real fight with 10 on 1. Now that was da shit. Mao laughed at the memory, his bad arm already becoming a little more animated. It seemed he really could shapeshift to heal himself. What bullshit. I wanna do so met in backquote like that again, a huge entrance with guns blazing backquote, breaking through and beating backquote da shit out of Evra backquote. Mao trailed off as he followed Midoriya's gaze to Midoriya's final solution. The shutter doors were metal, sure, and probably pretty thick. Big too, with a fancy looking lock at the bottom. Same for the side doors. But up above the side doors, right over the big shutter doors, up higher than even the top of the truck was one giant-ass window. Ronin and Mao stared at it for about 5 seconds, giving each other one final look before smiling at their new entrance plan. Ronin scaled the truck in a few seconds, drawing kindness and Cupid on the way up and putting several empowered bullets in just as many seconds into the warehouse's front window before it shattered, the glass cascading down onto whoever was unfortunate enough to be below the vigilante's new custom entrance. Ronin then cleared the distance between the truck and warehouse with one leap, falling a little short of the window but catching himself on the brickwork with Beowulf's bulkwork. He stumbled for just a moment before pulling himself up and over the broken windowsill, the last remnants of glass harmlessly breaking against his metal bodysuit. Mao didn't even need the truck to get up, running at and then up the warehouse's shutter door. He lobbed the studded bat through the window before jumping up the sheer wall, latching onto the window frame with his good arm to pull himself up and through with one fluid motion. He landed on the catwalk with a rough roll, grabbing his bat off the metal bracings and glass before taking in the warehouse beside Ronin. The warehouse beneath them was a chaotic mess as the Yakuza tried to adjust to the sudden intruders. Some pointed at them and drew weapons, some ran for the exits, but none of them mattered. Ronin and Mao didn't even need to look at each other as they smiled, feeling the old familiar rush as they both descended to the ground floor to sort these punks out. Mao didn't waste a second to get into the action, hopping the nearest railing and falling straight to the bottom floor, almost crushing an unlucky Yakuza on impact. The Yakuza scrambled out of the way, hopping backward while trying to get into a defensive pose, but even as he moved the great bat fell from the giant's shoulder. With only one arm Mao swung the bat, striking 2 Yakuza with one swing and launching them both off their feet, screaming all the way to the ground. The Yakuza didn't give him a chance for a second swing, jumping in at every angle with their own weapons. Pipes, bats, and knives flew towards Mao, but few found purchase on the giant's frame. The pipes and bats hardly mattered, just a few bruises he'd work off. A knife though. Mao faced the first knife with a gleam in his eye to outshine the knife itself, swinging his massive bat towards the knifeman's arm. The two met, clashing for barely a second before Mao overpowered the Yakuza and pushed his blade to the side. The knifeman stumbled back for a second, slightly off balance with his arm out of the way before being thrown completely off balance as Mao suddenly jutted forward, slamming his bestial mask into the Yakuza's skull. The poor Yakuza's legs gave out from under him, but Mao barely even noticed as he turned towards the next knifeman. He didn't seem to notice anything but that knifeman as he was showered by pipes and bats, smashing him with enough force to make him move, but not enough to make him break focus. Mao stared at that knifeman who charged forward, eyes wide as he realized what Mao was looking at. His arms shook but he screamed as he stepped in, stabbing the knife towards Mao with both hands before a giant bat came from nowhere and slammed into his arms, knocking it all aside and leaving his defenses wide open as Mao jutted forward again. Mao pushed through the baby bitch blows of the Yakuza, his grin going wilder and wilder before breaking into a full laugh as his mask crashed into his victim's skull. How could he ever lose focus with something this fun? Ronin's attention was on the Yakuza breaking for the doors, 4 to the close and 7 to the far exit. Ronin ran towards the front and closer exit, moving briefly along before jumping off the catwalk. He fell feet first towards the front wall, rebounding off it with a kick before landing in front of the exit and performing a sweeping kick to knock back one unfortunate Yakuza who got too close to the exit. The 4 Yakuza who fled this way almost backed down, but a glance back at the human tsunami taking on 7 guys at once versus the tiny man in front of them made the Yakuza change their minds. Even the man who got kicked stepped up as they ready to fight, weapons drawn. So Ronin drew his weapons to kindness and Cupid, out in under a second as Ronin took a wide steady stance, opening fire into oncoming men. The blast slammed into the first Yakuza, taking him down in 3 before he could get close. The second Yakuza got halfway to him before taking an air bullet to the leg, causing him to falter and then be blown aside. The third made it all the way to Ronin, rushing past his comrades and taking a wild swing with his sword, a real sword to boot, something Ronin hadn't even noticed at first. Ronin broke his own stance as he dodged, ducking sideways around the would-be swordsman and shooting him twice in the back, sending the swordsman careening into the wall before he turned to take on the final Yakuza his way. The last Yakuza came in quick punches at Ronin's face, forcing the vigilante to duck and weave to avoid getting a face full of knuckles. Ronin slowly moved back as he weaved, trying to escape the Yakuza's range to best use his own guns, but the Yakuza kept pace with Ronin and moved forward as the vigilante moved back. In just a few steps his back hit the door he had rushed in to block, giving him nowhere else to run. The Yakuza sneered as he stepped in, throwing a powerful punch at the vigilante's head as Ronin leaned back against the door, feeling its solidity before planting a foot on it and jumping knee first into the Yakuza. The sudden knee took the Yakuza in the stomach, forcing him back as Ronin suddenly took the lead. Ronin slammed the butts of his pistols into the sides of the man's head as he tried to retreat, causing the Yakuza to reel back before the vigilante stuffed both barrels into his chest and fired again. Just as the Yakuza he shot started to get up, the final Yakuza rolled past them before dropping painfully to the floor, barely moving. The Yakuza barely had a chance to look at their comrade in arms, barely seeing what was done to him before they met the one that did it to him. The Yakuza were still getting off the floor when Ronin ran into them, slamming the first's head between his knee and his pistol before kicking him to the ground and shooting him several times in the chest. The second almost managed to look at him before Ronin hit him with a running kick, sending the man up into his feet before Ronin buried more shots into him, approaching all the while before kicking his legs out from under him and shooting him a few more times before he could even hit the ground. The last Yakuza was already trying to run to the other exit when his leg was shot, the sudden force making him stumble before he took another one to the shoulder, then a third to the back. The force took him down to the floor, but before he could even put his arms down to catch himself, it descended on him. He wasn't even conscious for the last 7 shots. Mao kicked off the last knifeman, pivoting on the spot and turning to drive his knee into a second man's stomach. His next victim was knocked airborne as he spat blood, barely able to breathe let alone focus on the giant bat that flew so gracefully off the giant's shoulder and into his stomach, knocking the poor victim out of the air and straight into the ground. Mao moved forward with his knockdown hit, laughing and charging the other Yakuza in his way. Some managed to dive out of the way, but one took the main man's attack head-on, Mao's shoulder slamming into the man's chest before Mao lifted him into the air like a raging bull. The man flailed, whacking and wiggling to try and get free, but there was only one way off the pain train. Mao still held his bat with one hand, slamming it down across the man's back before turning and throwing the man at the other Yakuza. The other Yakuza were forced to jump out of the way again as the victim hit the ground, careening for a few feet before he stopped, a heap of bruises and tangled limbs barely conscious enough to scream anymore. The attacks from the Yakuza came slower now as they were more cautious. They still circled him, little bitches that they were, but the barrage itself had ended. After all, what man wanted to go head-to-head with that thing? Yakuza Hunter stood 6 feet tall, carrying his massive bat in one hand like a toy. His mask was riddled with scratches and dents from a long time of abuse, but the man beneath it was as ready for a fight as ever. Even with one of his arms hanging limp, still painted red from the gunshot, he cut an imposing figure. But he was mortal, he had to be. He'd been shot. One of his arms was weak, and they could use that weakness. As Yakuza Hunter surveyed his foes, one Yakuza jumped out. He was closest to the hunter's bad arm, so he couldn't be attacked back. He moved in quickly, grabbing his pipe with both hands before swinging at the vigilante's ribs. Ha! Mao saw this coming, and it made sense. He would have done the same thing after all. Mao didn't have time to pivot again, so he stepped back, letting the pipe swing past while he turned his good arm towards the punk. His good arm gripped the weird studded bat hard before he stepped back in, taking his own swing in retaliation at the Yakuza. Ha! And that's when another Yakuza stepped in with his sword, cause why not have a real fucking sword in a warehouse? Mao couldn't help but smile as the sword came towards him. This wasn't the kind of thing he would have predicted since he always fought alone. Even back when he ran the chillers, he was more of a final boss than a captain. Just the way things were. Mao changed his stance mid-swing, going wide as he forced himself further. His swing went wide as he turned his body again, massive club meeting katana before completely overpowering it all while two Yakuza stepped in, taking advantage of his new massive openings to get some cheap shots in. Of course, he was only one man. There were limits to how many angles you could cover, especially with one hand. The bat might have helped, but there was only so much you could do as a man. But he wasn't just any man, not by a long shot. He was the main man. Ronin crossed the warehouse towards the other exit, the side exit the other runners had tried to use. They had further to run, but he had to deal with 4 Yakuza. They had a head start on dealing with the lock and things would get bad if they made it out. Right now, even if reinforcements got here, they'd have to deal with the locked doors Mao and Ronin had to while they finished mopping up these guys. They'd be on the defensive and have a harder time getting out. It'd take longer to make an escape, giving time for more backup, and possibly even heroes. The long and short of it was those doors could not open. Ronin used kindness and Cupid to shoot at the door, but with the small crowd of 7 Yakuza, they could only hit the outermost shell of people. The men turned towards him, barely giving the door a second glance before fully facing him. Someone had to open the door, but someone needed to buy time, and by the way they moved it seemed the Brotherhood ran deep. It was almost impressive if it wasn't about to run him over. Ronin continued to use kindness and Cupid to take pot shots, but power had never been their forte. The charged shot was a force to be reckoned with, but that took time Ronin wasn't willing to spare as he ran towards the wave of Yakuza. Several shots were good but lacked power as the wave closed in on him. It wasn't enough to stop them. One of the Yakuza yelled as he lowered his head, charging Ronin like a bull and suddenly bursting from the pack. Ronin stirred up his stance, keeping it wide and steady like he'd been taught as he took aim. He kept his guns running hot as the man charged, hitting him several times in the legs and body, but the man would not be stopped. The charging Yakuza plowed through Ronin's attacks easily, extending his arms just as Ronin tried to swerve to the side and catching the vigilante with an armbar. Ronin was suddenly shunted backward as the Yakuza kept running, trying to stabilize himself before the situation got worse. Ronin tried to plant his feet on the ground and push back, but his boots skidded across the ground before he finally stopped, body slammed into one of the warehouse's support beams. The air was shoved out of Midoriya's chest on impact, the world starting to spin as pain coursed through his entire back, the same place he'd been shot just a minute ago. His legs shook as the Yakuza took a few steps back, looking down at the vigilante before stepping in to finish the winded and weakened fighter. Midoriya could scarcely think as he fell towards the ground, trying to regain the strength in his legs as he saw the next hit incoming. It would be to his face, his weakness once again. How the hell did heroes get through all of this without helmets? But as his thoughts drifted away from the moment, his body came back into it. He dropped the 2 pistols as his left reached for his scabbard, taking that first painful breath in. He pulled the says forward as he planted his feet, feeling his strength return with that one hot breath in. The air filled his rattled chest as he leaned forward, his right arm pulling across his body to grab Muramasa's handle. He might not have been able to think, but he didn't need to. After all, he'd done this one so many times, it was muscle memory. Savage style. The Ronin glared up through bleary eyes as the Yakuza stepped in for his next attack, speaking to himself through gritted teeth. First form. Then, as Yakuza and Vigilante moved forward, a flash. A gunshot from a sheath as a sword carved through the air in a single sweep, slicing everything in its path. Violence. Despite the mess going on in Warehouse H, with the raid and all, Warehouse I was pretty quiet. Warehouse J was on the fritz, with all the little Yakuza in it getting their feathers in a twist as they packed their things before going to help their brothers in arms, but I. Nothing but quiet as he sat in Warehouse I, quietly tapping his foot to the rhythm in his head, quietly humming to a melody no one else could hear, all was quiet. The blue screen he read made no sound as it floated in his palm, the text scrolling by as he checked everything one last time. Quick fight, a few minutes long, one guy, pretty basic, pretty simple. Should be over quick. A gunshot pierced the gentle tapping, giving the figure pause as he glanced past his screen. Loud enough to be heard through buildings, some kind of rifle round. It sounded like something was going down outside of Warehouse I, something fun. His eyes flicked up from the screen as a smile crossed the showman's lips, leaning forward in the chair towards the oncoming excitement. This was going to be good, he could just feel it. The Last Samurai. Damn, what a name. Chapter and notes. Yo, a few quick fights to try and show how hard vigilantism is, especially with guns, while also trying to balance 2 different fighters with 2 very different fighting styles throwing down in the same room and at the same time. Here's hoping the flow didn't crash too badly. They don't even peek at their fighting styles at the same time. Ronin's all good at the start of a fight while Mao needs to build his hype, but as the fight goes on and the surprise goes away, they flip. They don't get worse or better, they just each have their own strengths. The main idea was to show this as a bullet point in both their paths, with both having their own weaknesses and strengths. Atop of that, like it says in the chapter's intro, this chapter was about the two of them, working together, with some heavy finger quoting around that. So far Midoriya and Mao working together didn't even involve them in the same building at the same time. Midoriya holding off the police in an alley while Mao clears the building, Mao keeping watch while Midoriya searches an office. The idea was that since neither of them has ever really worked with other people, they're bad at it. They don't so much work together as have similar goals in the same place at the same time. This is, I think, the first time they've actually fought together at the same time, so there are some rough patches. They don't even try to help each other when dealing with the Yakuza. All things need a base to branch out of, so hopefully I get better at writing these kinds of big fights with multiple characters fighting multiple characters while these two clowns learn that teamwork isn't something you just do in a training room. But that's enough of that. Fan art. From me. Author art. Whatever. Big shout out to my first editor, Gubby_Gub_GU. We decided to make drawings of our favorite character who hasn't gotten much art herself, Eiko. Glad it's in a chapter that she never even shows up in, cause foresight is hard for a guy who never shuts up about setup and payoff. Well, Merry Chrysler and adios. Also posting this before Ebony Bird of Doom gets a chance to did it. Sorry bye. Chapter 201, Terrible Teamwork. Chapter Summary. Though things start rough, with time and effort they can smooth out. Well, it's still not smooth, but at this point anything would be better than that start. Seriously, Ronin, get ya act together. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. The two vigilantes' raid on the Yakuza warehouse seemed to be going sideways. The first group of Yakuza had the large one surrounded, attacking at him from all sides. They waited until he swung his weapon before diving in for the kill, attacking from behind so he couldn't defend himself. The fight should have been over right there. The two Yakuza behind Mao stepped in with pipe and wooden katana already swinging to smash into the giant's back and take him down a peg. With his back turned, he couldn't defend himself. He wouldn't be able to react in time or block, so how would this big oaf stop one attack from behind, let alone two? Simple. The main man barely glanced over his shoulder at the two rushing Yakuza, smiled, then shot his leg backward, driving the heel of his boot into the first man's ribs, cracking them on the spot before launching him to the floor like a rocket. The second man barely paused. It was only a moment as his eyes followed his friend fly to the floor so fast you could have sworn he was diving for it, but before the second Yakuza could refocus the giant's leg swept around to slam into his temple. Most people wouldn't know how to deal with a surprise attack, but Mao was no ordinary man. He knew the best way to deal with every attack harder. The second Yakuza stumbled back, hurt but not down, as he regrounded himself. Both hands grabbed the metal pipe like a sword, the grip becoming tighter as he focused through the pain to the fight. Bam. Mao's shin slammed into the metal pole the punk had raised as a guard, denting the metal and shoving the little bitch several feet backward. The Yakuza was having trouble standing, and when Mao was through with him, he wouldn't even be able to do that. Mao stepped off his spinning front kick and ran towards his newest focus, laughing as he tossed the bat to the side to free up his good arm before body slamming the smaller man. The Yakuza barely had time to correct his stance from the last heavy blow he took before Mao slammed into him like a freight train, picking him straight off the ground and running with him straight into one of the warehouse's large metal support beams. The man recoiled from the force, barely getting a gasp out as his ribs also broke before going slack. Mao held him against the metal beam for a second longer, admiring his work with a massive grin. Paying back little bitches that thought they could get cheap shots on him always felt great. Shit. What the fuck is he? Mao glanced back at the other Yakuza, the last three from the first group. It also looked like that first guy might not be done yet by how he was squirming around on the ground. Mao's grin only got wider as he dropped his final victim, turning to fully face the group as he flexed his bad arm. It looked like he had a little more revenge to get before he was done. The bull-like Yakuza was the first to reach the smaller vigilante, charging past the rest to slam through the vigilante's pathetic attacks before driving him into one of the warehouse's massive metal pillars. The vigilante struggled before slamming into the pillar, hitting the metal hard enough to dent it. The vigilante himself went slightly slack from the heavy blow, mumbling and stumbling forward a bit as he dropped his weapons. Looked like he had the wind knocked out of him by his dazed reaction, soft murmurs to himself while sinking down. The Yakuza smirked as he built distance, rolling his shoulders before sinking his head down. If that little punk had thought that last rush had hurt, wait till he felt this one. The Yakuza suddenly surged forward, shouting as he crossed his arms in front of himself to brace for the impact as he lunged forward, then cut short as something just as heavy struck him back. What? Ronin grit his teeth as he used Muramasa's gun sheath, sending his blade hurtling forward with ludicrous speed. The blade crashed into the charging Yakuza, digging into his arms for just a moment before the massive sword swing tore through him. The Yakuza was pushed back a few inches as the blade ripped across his arms, stopping him dead in his tracks and forcing him to lose all momentum. He couldn't yet feel the stinging in his arms as he tried to figure out what just happened, barely getting the chance to lower his arms to try and find the vigilante before the vigilante's sword found him. Ronin hit the Yakuza with the drawing cut center mass, knocking the foe back and buying himself a moment's respite, but a drawing cut was not violence. Not true violence by a long shot. Ronin followed his opening cut with a small step to the side, moving around the Yakuza to get around his guard while raising Muramasa over his head. Then, the moment the guard began to slip, as the Yakuza looked around for the vigilante, wham! The flat of the blade struck the Yakuza across the skull, driving his head down with one swing. The Yakuza stumbled before two more swings struck his head again, knocking him around like a pinball before Ronin lunged towards him, climbing the Yakuza's crushing form to gain height before slamming Muramasa's pommel into the back of the Yakuza's head. The Yakuza barely had a chance to lower his arms before three strikes quickly passed them, all three hitting him upside the head before a fourth and final sunk into the base of his skull. He managed to finally see his attacker as his body went limp, the world going dark as everything began to shift. Thunder style. Ronin now pushed towards the wave of Yakuza, meeting their own screams with his own as he ran. He sheathed his sword as he sprinted, lining up his hands for the next attack. The Yakuza didn't back down, they never did. Their ferocity only built up as the fight got more dire right until the last second. They snarled and shouted, they charged, and they raised their weapons. Thunderclap. In the blink of an eye Ronin closed the distance, striking underneath the Yakuza's raised weapons. He rushed the leftmost Yakuza, pulling the trigger on his gun sheath and shooting his sword into the man's stomach pommel first. Ronin spun before the first man finished falling, twisting his body to fully draw his sword while pivoting to avoid the next Yakuza's swing. The pole swung past Ronin's twisted frame, Ronin staring at the metallic club for just a moment before stepping back in with his own. Ronin didn't miss. His spinning strike slashed through the second man's defenses, downing him on the first hit, so Ronin moved on. The Yakuza moved to surround him, but Ronin moved first. Quick small steps, shifting his position before the Yakuza could react. One dashed to the side, trying to surround Ronin, but Ronin instead dashed behind the lone Yakuza to cut him off from the rest, slamming Muramasa's pommel into his spine before turning head on and slashing downward, felling this Yakuza in 2 hits instead of 1. What an honor. The Yakuza moved toward Ronin, so Ronin moved back toward them. He kicked his last victim so hard that the already stunned Yakuza flew through the air, forcing the oncoming foes to step out of the way to dodge their flying comrade. The moment those Yakuza took their eyes off the real threat to dodge their friend, however, he struck. Ronin jutted forward with a shoulder tackle, slamming into a Yakuza sideways before taking a small step back to get proper distance and strike him with Muramasa. Ronin's horizontal slash met the man's pole, brought up in a desperate bid to defend, then bounced off as Ronin redirected. Ronin turned his deflected sideways slash into his oldest trick, stepping in with an overhead slash. The man tried to regain his defenses as he raised his pole, blocking the first hit while losing ground, but he did successfully block the first hit. Then came the second. Ronin swung his sword overhead a second time, then a third, then a fourth and a fifth, swinging over and over again while constantly advancing. The Yakuza did well, he really did. He parried the second just as well as the first, and the third after that. However, even if he blocked the attacks, he was losing ground as he stepped back repeatedly, unable to regain his composure under the constant pressure. Not that Ronin would let him. 10, 11, 12 hits in a row as Ronin put his entire body into Savage Style's first technique. Even if he didn't say its name out loud, he could feel himself being swept into the motions as he pressed down the attack. He stepped in with his lead leg, he pushed off with his back, and he drove everything he had into slamming Muramasa down as fast and hard as he could. His body twisted, his feet dug in, and his arms burned as he pushed himself further and further. The other Yakuza tried to move in, but the sheer aura of Ronin's intensity held them back as he attacked, pressing the Yakuza further and further back until he was at the very wall he had come from. The Yakuza quivered but didn't back down, holding up his pole for the next guard only to have the pole seared in half by Muramasa's saw-like edge. The severed pole and Ronin's blade flew, the sword delivering 3 swift strikes to the Yakuza's body. The criminal adjusted his stance, trying to shield himself with what was left of the pole, but the pipe couldn't guard against the seemingly living blade. In 3 hits the Yakuza fell back against the wall, putting in the effort to try and get up before a sudden kick connected to his stomach and forced him further into the warehouse's wall, leaving the criminal gasping for breath while he collapsed on the stone warehouse floor. Ronin kicked off the Yakuza to finish him, turning around to refocus his energy on his next targets. They came out swinging and he dove in dancing, using his quick footwork to evade their attacks. The first charged him with an overhead, swinging his plank of wood straight down. Ronin swatted the plank of wood to the side, stepping past the Yakuza while rebounding she blade off the wood and into the man's stomach. The next rushed him with a side grip, bringing the plank from his right side towards Ronin's skull. Ronin moved to the man's left side, forcing the swing to overextend and miss while he carried on. Third and fourth barely had a direction as they swung, meaning they could be guided even easier. Their frantic swings were batted aside by Muramasa while Ronin kept running past everything, barely sparing time to even retaliate against his attackers. Fifth was the last one to run forward, adjusting his knuckle dusters before springing forward with a punch directly at Ronin's torso. It was a fast punch from such a big guy, looked like it might hurt. Ronin wouldn't know, using his small size to weave under the punch by suddenly dropping lower. He crouched underneath the punch, driving his elbow into the man's ribs as he passed and forcing the criminal to flinch while making his escape. The last man was the one by the door, the man Ronin aimed to stop. The door was already open, but with everyone focusing on the fight, nobody had noticed and made a break for it. Even the man who opened the door himself was standing there, looking resolute right until Ronin came charging in. The last Yakuza took one look at the rushing vigilante and turned tail. Ronin was fast, but the last Yakuza was right next to the door. He wouldn't make it in time. He could either chase the man outside and try stopping the fleeing criminal before anyone else could leave or let him get away and focus on the rest. Fighting a defensive battle wasn't Ronin's strength, so the first option was more difficult, but the second option seemed like giving up. So Ronin made a third option. Ronin sheathed Muramasa mid-stride, squinting to try and gauge distance before firing the gun sheath and performing another drawing cut, this time while activating Muramasa's quirk. The final Yakuza was out the door when the gunshot split the air, but he couldn't resist looking back. The urge was irresistible, a sense of urgency and panic as he wondered what happened, demanding him to just take half a second to peek back and see it. Ronin seemed to freeze as he released Muramasa's stored power, launching a wave of concentrated energy from Muramasa, a massive flying red blade that split the air with a terrifying hiss. The huge blade struck the man across the back, enveloping him with a flash of red before sending him crashing to the ground. Once he crashed, he made no move to get up again. He was finished. Ronin didn't have time to waste admiring his handiwork, spinning instead on his heel in the same drawing cut to face the Yakuza he just passed by. He retraced his steps, striking down the Yakuza he first slipped past. The knuckleduster barely had time to right himself before eating the flat of Muramasa's blade, sending him from rising off the ground right back down into it. Ronin stepped around his falling body and to the next Yakuza, moving into range with a slash. The Yakuza parried, both putting their weight behind their weapons as if to throw the other back for a moment before Ronin slipped to one side. The Yakuza pushed forward still, all resistance suddenly gone and leaving him stumbling as Ronin rocked into range with a spinning back kick. Another Yakuza down. Ronin moved quickly to turn back to the fight, but the next Yakuza was quicker. Ronin spun to face the next foe to suddenly be face to face with one of those hardwood katanas. He dropped under the swing, then rose to meet the Yakuza tackle to tackle. Their weapons were useless at such close range, shoulder to shoulder as each pushed against each other, but 3 sudden quick hooks to the ribs from Ronin ended the struggle quickly. The punches pushed back the larger Yakuza bit by bit, stealing enough room for one proper swing. Ronin didn't waste a second as he grabbed his sword with both hands, flicking the pommel into the man's temple before slamming it properly into the man's head. The only sudden move that Yakuza could make was his sudden crash to the ground. Ronin released one hand off Muramasa to shove the crashing Yakuza out of his way, charging past the falling criminal to hit the last 2 Yakuza. The last 2 Yakuza swung their weapons hard, using their numbers to keep Ronin under constant pressure and push back his rushing advance. One swung high, one swung low, one came left, the other went right. Ronin was pushed to only blocking as he held his ground, meeting their large swings with his own sharp strikes. His sword was fast, rich-shotting from attack to attack, but the pace they drove was hard and fast. In a few short seconds it became clear he couldn't keep matching their speeds in just 2 to 1. He was holding his own, but slowly losing ground. He could feel himself being gradually outpaced, so rather than struggle and slide back, Ronin jumped toward one of the Yakuza. The Yakuza slammed his pipe into Ronin's shoulder, sending a wave of pain through the vigilante, but it was an opening in the rhythm. With Ronin's sudden shift, the attack had come early, ruining the Yakuza's flow and giving a chance for countering. Ronin barely flinched at the pain and shoulder-checked the pipe, batting it away with his entire arm to then bring his own sword sharply down on the criminal's shoulder. The flat of Muramasa's blade might not have been sharp, but by the loud crack his metal met bone, it was enough. The Yakuza howled in pain, brows knit as he grabbed his shoulder. It seemed someone hadn't come wearing armor. It was a good hit, but then again, so was the sudden hit that took Ronin to the back. Having forced himself to focus on one opponent left him open to the other Yakuza, and it would not be excused. The last Yakuza slammed his hardwood into Ronin's back, sending the vigilante stumbling forward a step. Ronin turned heel and raised his sword, but it was barely in time to meet the Yakuza's own swings. The Yakuza took the advantage he had and ran with it, pushing hard to keep Ronin off the ball. If he took long enough, the other Yakuza would recover, and then they'd be back to the 2 versus 1. If the Yakuza wasn't so focused, however, he might have noticed that it wasn't 2 versus 1. The Yakuza stepped in for an overhead strike when his sword was caught midair. He pulled with all his might, glaring back to try and see what happened before catching a boot with his face. Mao ripped the hardwood katana from the Yakuza's grip with his kick, launching the criminal while holding onto the katana with one hand. The giant glanced down at the stick, tossing it twice before crushing it half with one hand and stepping back in to finish his fight. Ronin watched just long enough to make sure everything was going well before turning back to his own fight. His Yakuza wasn't down yet, after all, so splitting his attention anymore would be detrimental. His Yakuza was working his shoulder, gripping his weapon with both hands to try and distribute the force. He pointed the pipe at Ronin as if to gouge right through him, but Ronin wasn't deterred by some pipe. Ronin looked him over before taking a proper sword stance, daring the Yakuza to make the first move. A second of the two looking each other over, standing a few feet apart. Their weapons hung in the air, tips a few inches apart. One sudden flick would put one into the range of the other. The Yakuza moved first, rushing for Ronin's body. Ronin stepped aside, letting Muramasa meet and guide the Yakuza's pipe away from his body. It was just like his practice with Kaminari, range was key. Ronin hit the pipe to the left and moved right, then released another charged slash from Muramasa while building distance. The Yakuza couldn't even right his guard as the Crimson Crescent overtook him, slamming into him and driving him back several feet before dissipating. Ronin blinked twice, glancing between Muramasa and the red streak of energy it had produced. Quote. That's new. The other fight also wrapped up quickly. The Yakuza hurried to his feet as the main man confidently strode over, raising his fists before shouting and throwing his first punch. Mao glanced down through his mask, sidestepping the large swing and letting the Yakuza rush past him. The Yakuza slowed himself, eyes still on Mao before rushing in again. He charged once more, and Mao stepped to the side once more, still not meeting him. The Yakuza stopped much faster this time, too angry to think reasonably as he rushed in with a flurry of punches. Mao kept moving back, weaving his body between the punches with grace unbefitting his large form. He didn't say a word as he let the barrage carry on, biding his time until he found a good opening. The Yakuza swung and swung, angrier and angrier with every punch that missed until his opponent stopped back up and met him, grabbing his arm mid-swing. The Yakuza didn't even try to break free, instead swinging his other arm which was caught, just as the first. The Yakuza barely got a chance to resist before he was pulled upward, his head slammed against the gangster's mask and leaving him dazed. Mao pulled back from his headbutt, looking over his target before smiling and switching grips. With his good arm he grabbed the punk by the throat, lifting him into the air while he worked his other arm. It had been feeling better through the fighting, but there was nothing like a good punch to test whether it was really back in fighting condition. The Yakuza woke from his daze right as Mao wound up his punch, getting a chance to scream before the giant fist crashed into his face and sent him bounding along the warehouse floor. He skipped a few times as Mao pulled back, checking his shoulder. The injuries had become mere dents in his arm, and even that was fading. He worked his arm in 2 more circles before punching his palm and smiling. That punch felt good. Midoriya looked over his defeated opponent, checking that he had truly stopped moving before breaking out the zip ties and beginning to wrap things up. You alive, Hunter? Damn straight, that sheet was hella fun. His partner laughed from further in the warehouse, coming into view with the last Yakuza laid out over his shoulder. And you was all worried about this bullshit Tilda. Get this tight on their arms. Midoriya tossed a bag of zip ties to the giant, still staying focused on his own work. It didn't take long to get the Yakuza zipped up. With their arms secured, the Yakuza were moved together out of the way while Ronin and Mao checked the contents of the warehouse itself, still reflecting on the fight in their own ways. Ya know, the start of that fight. Real shitty. Mao voiced his thoughts as Midoriya checked the various boxes around the warehouse. Bullets by the dozen, stacked and ready to ship the stuff in there was illegal, no doubt about it, but it wasn't what Midoriya had been looking for. He'd been on the search for drugs, specifically wherever the Yakuza had been storing all their drugs before they shipped them out. A hit there would be a lot worse to the market than just targeting a few dealers. Yeah, day fighting isn't my thing. Way too open, too. Midoriya didn't think much about the last fight, focusing ahead. Looking out the window was the next warehouse, and it seemed to be a hive of activity. He could see people moving already, so they had to strike before the Yakuza could put their contraband on a truck and flee. Saw you eatin' some lead, how da fuck you walking that sheet off like it's nothing. Mao gestured with his own arm that had been shot which looked fine now, because of course Mao could recover from getting shot the fucking cheater. Midoriya's jacket and its newest bullet holes. The bodysuit and bulletproof vest. Midoriya checked his equipment and looked to the next warehouse, planning how he'd try to hit them. It stops bullets pretty well, but the bruising's a bitch. I got used to it though. Midoriya wasn't faster than a bullet, after all. As long as the gun was pointed at him and the trigger was pulled, he was probably getting hit. The trick was that he was faster than most of the idiots who pointed those guns. As long as he could get the jump on a shooter and take them down faster than they could aim, he'd be walking away with no new holes in his coat. Mao glanced at his injured arm, though to still call it injured was a stretch. Real HMPH, somebody better get started Mac in ma bodysuit. Then we better get a move on taking out those guys, I don't want any runaways. Midoriya leaned against the doorframe as he planned his route. It seemed just a small time away from the streets had dulled his edge. How would he hit the band of Yakuza normally? From the dark, when the Yakuza could barely see. His old helmet's night vision put the dark in his favor, and even without it, he had no allies to worry about hitting. But it was daytime, and he did have an ally to worry about shooting, so the plan would change. The Yakuza were still loading up, quickly taking big boxes out of their warehouse before shoving them into the back of a moving truck. They'd already been going for about 2 minutes, so if the Yakuza were going to be stopped, it better be soon. Midoriya licked his lips, hand anxiously tapping away on his katana before he looked down and smiled. Got Anna backquote ideas, smart stuff. I might backquote be tough, but I don't wanna be no pincushion. Mao moved beside the scheming vigilante trying to read his face through the cloth mask but drawing a few guesses by the vigilante's confident posture as he stood. Ideas. He pushed off the wall, pulling out kindness and swapping magazines. They wanted to try and leave with a truck. They could try all they wanted, but nobody said they'd get far. Yeah, I got a few. Ronan's smile beneath his mask was small but strong as he checked the magazine, then let his eyes trail up to the other warehouses. He had more tricks up his oversized sleeves than just the dark. Time to show a few. Packing the drugs back into the truck was a bit of a mess. Shipments were swapped, covers were lost, and people were panicking. The Yakuza weren't loaders or whatever, they were generally just here to make sure anything didn't go tits up. Stand around, look intimidating, and stop any authorities from pushing in. So what did they do when shit hit the fan and one of their warehouses was attacked? They weren't trained, they were barely even instructed, so they scrambled. They barked orders, they got moving, and they moved fast. The shipments were packed back into the truck to flee the scene while the rest held the attacking forces back. It only took a few minutes to get the truck ready, but those few minutes seemed long as the men assembled. Almost everyone helped to load the truck, but almost everyone kept a hand on their weapons and an eye peeled for those heroes. Couldn't drop your guard at a time like this. With their attention split and the tension high, the Yakuza loaded up their truck, nervously checking over their shoulders. There was no siren of the police, no bragging or camera of the heroes. A strike force. Truck's ready. Truck's ready. Relief came as the truck was loaded with as much as they could afford to push in, 2 men dropping from the truck's bed while closing the door behind them. Doors shut and doors locked quickly before giving the truck a hard strike across the back to the driver. Get moving. The truck peeled out of the parking lot, driving away to the safety of distance. The Yakuza looked out as their last ship set sail, leaving them stranded with no way out but through whatever opposed them. With that truck gone, it was going to just be them from here on out. Bang. The truck's escape was cut short as something huge and heavy struck the front of the truck, rocking the entire thing as the tire exploded, sending the entire truck careening down the path and swerving sidelong into another warehouse. The truck continued for several meters scraping along the wall, creating a shower of sparks as it slowed and pulled away. The driver could barely steer the truck with how fast it had been going, to suddenly lose one of the front wheels. He was lucky enough the crash had been sidelong and he could recover, else. Crew till lunch. The driver suddenly straightened in his seat as something heavy dropped from the nearby warehouse and crushed the hood of the truck, creating a loud cacophony as the already stressed engine took heavy abuse. The heavy object that had fallen pulled itself out of the engine block, arms flinging small shards of metal as it rose before meeting the driver face to face. The driver's grip on the wheel made his knuckles white as he stared eye to eye with the Yakuza hunter. The Yakuza hunter's smile was ear to ear as he locked eyes with his next victim. The Yakuza at the warehouse stared in stunned horror as the payload that should have been driving away to safety came under direct assault. Finally, the vigilante standing across the way standing atop an entirely different warehouse checked his handiwork. He might not have been the best shot with a gun, but staring at that truck and its shredded tire, the results couldn't be doubted. Ronin nodded to himself, smiling as he switched magazines, glancing over the rooftops towards the Yakuza back at the warehouse. The truck was only half the plan, after all, so now it was time to finish this warehouse up. They had a lot of work ahead of them, after all, no time to slow down now. The vigilantes fell upon the Yakuza like lightning, coming in with a two-pronged attack. Yakuza hunter started at the truck, demolishing everything in his way as it approached. Yakuza ran out from 2 nearby warehouses to try and offer help only to be crushed as they finally reached the truck, the main man staking his turf and sticking to it to avoid being surrounded twice. They came in packs, but with his huge weird studded bat and both arms back in fighting condition, Mao took them out in swarms. The air hummed as he launched powerful attacks over and over, powering through multiple men as he powered through the air itself. Many a time he rammed the Yakuza into the side of the already crashed truck, creating large dents and gouges in its side as he lobbed man after man into it. One more perk of him taking the truck, he was nowhere near any guns. With a long range and a crowd of meat shields between him and any gunfire, Mao could rule the small truck unimpeded with a defensive battle as he sat back, happy to crush anything and everything that challenged. And why would the gunmen worry about the muscle man who crashed their truck? They had plenty of their own problems to worry about. The swarms of Yakuza were hit by large blasts from above, wave after wave of force slamming into them from above and moving in closer. The shooter approached from the rooftops, covering the large gaps between buildings with seemingly Herculean jumps. His coat flitted in the wind as he moved, his form shifted, but the echo of his guns let everyone know what he was about. He could be the Ranger, he could be Snipe, he could be Al Capone for all it mattered, but what was really important was that he was packing some serious firepower, shooting at everything and everyone stupid enough to stand still without cover. The Yakuza were pushed back into their warehouse to escape the blasts, breaking off any cover for their brothers at the truck to save themselves. A few men had been unlucky from the first shots, thrown aside like leaves in the wind. They lay strewn about outside the warehouse's main door, helpless prey for the encroaching hunter. The Yakuza kept an eye on the sky and a tight handle on their weapons as they assessed their situation before making their decision and closing the front gate. It was hard to leave their brothers for dead, but between the hammer in the sky and the anvil on the ground, there was nothing they could do. With heavy hearts they closed the building, seeing sure the doors were all locked before they worked on the main door. To make sure it couldn't be reopened, they cut the main chain holding the door open, making the heavy shutter door slide shut. But as the door slid along its runners to the ground, fast footsteps broke across the ground. Coming up quick on the falling shutter door, Ronin sprinted as hard as he could before sliding along the ground to barely skim into the warehouse before the main door slammed shut with a thunderous crash. The Yakuza took a step back at the intruder's sudden appearance. Ronin took a head count and gripped his steel. He said he needed to go faster, so it was time to get going. No holding back. 13 men locked in a massive warehouse with one child. The vigilante pushed off the floor, turning his slide into a sprint as he closed in on the nearest 2 Yakuza to dive right in. Running towards them, Ronin checked his grip on Ramasa. One hand on the gun sheath, the other resting lightly atop the handle. Then, as he closed distance, tightened his grip and... Bang! There was a hell of an echo in that warehouse, the sound so loud it hurt almost as much as the flashing crimson. Ronin hit the first two Yakuza with the same drawing hit, knocking both aside while he pushed toward his next opponents. The Yakuza crowd hung on just a moment longer, stunned at his speed then coming back to their senses. They gripped their own weapons, pointing their guns at the metallic blur, but in the time it took them to take beat he had moved. He rushed a gunman, batting their gun up before hitting them in the chest with 2 slashes. The man crumpled while Ronin turned, carrying the momentum of 2 slashes into 2 more as he took on the next Yakuza. A gun pointed his way one moment was slammed down the next by Muramasa, disarming the Yakuza before Ronin finished him off with one heavy blow to the chest. We've got him. Get clear. The Yakuza tried to avoid pointing toward each other as they trained their guns on the intruder, the remaining men spreading out to surround the vigilante. Ronin stepped up, using the last Yakuza as cover while he surveyed the surrounding crowd. Lot of guns pointed his way, more than he could probably dodge on his own, especially with some guy as his only shield to hide behind. His legs tensed as he reached into his jacket, fiddling for a moment while the Yakuza rallied up their defenses. They encircled the vigilante to cut off any escape but left gaps to make sure they didn't hit each other. Those without guns hung back, but were still ready to move at the drop of a hat. Ronin counted up the men again, glancing over his shoulder to make sure everything was in place. Didn't want anyone to miss the show. Nervous glances between the Yakuza became stern as they strengthened their resolve, thinking over the risks of shooting their enemy versus shooting their ally. The guns became steady, waiting for the first sign to fire. Everyone wanted to fire and nobody wanted to be the first, so Ronin would take the lead. Now, pieing. It was unclear to the Yakuza who shouted, but with one word the entire warehouse lit up as Ronin dropped the already primed flashbang out of his coat and onto his own feet. Ronin leapt to action as soon as he shouted, grabbing his last victim and dashing to one side as the blinded Yakuza began to open fire. The spread of bullets went everywhere, closer to hitting the other Yakuza than their vigilante intruder. Ronin tossed the criminal aside as he left the range of bullets and used his muscle suit to get some serious height, leaping onto then kicking off a support beam to get into the warehouse's rafters while dropping a few more presents for his friends below. The Yakuza staggered about, clutching their ringing ears and burning eyes, slowly coming to only to be enveloped by thick gray smoke. Visibility dropped to 0 as the Yakuza searched the area, jumpy at every and anything. The Yakuza shouted and yelled, pointing and attacking each other while Ronin quietly watched atop the rafters, crouching above them all. Fighting alone really was his thing it seemed. Mao was good and all, a solid tank, but he'd be annoying in times like this. After all, if Ronin had a teammate right now, he'd have to check who he was attacking before he hurt someone. Ronin targeted a random head, barely visible through the smoke, and struck. He plucked a needle from within his coat, tossing it once to get a good grasp of the weight before hurling it down into the smoky cloud. Checking his balance on the narrow metal beam, Ronin prowled toward his next target. A few men were stumbling out of the fog and into the clear, but he couldn't have that. He threw a quick barrage of needles towards the furthest men before jumping down himself. The Yakuza could barely see, let alone defend themselves. Disoriented and confused, no one was prepared for a ranged bombardment of strange glass-like knives, and they sure as shit weren't ready when a figure dived down from above and used one of them as a landing pad. Taking a page from his first fight against toxic lovers, Ronin pushed off the rafters and body-checked one of the Yakuza, using him to cushion his landing before pushing off the ground and onto his next target. He couldn't see where anything was exactly either, but even a general idea of where they hid was enough. The coughing, the cursing, and the echoes of their steps gave them away. Ronin's light steps became heavy as he suddenly built up steam before plowing into the back of the Yakuza, slamming his shoulder into the man before kicking a leg out. The man tried to catch himself, arms flailing to regain his balance, making it easy for Ronin to grab him by the shirt and arm to judo throw him into the next Yakuza. The two Yakuza had a rough collision, but the attack wasn't as heavy as Ronin's first two. No, it gave the new Yakuza a chance to recover and attack whatever just hit him, slamming the butt of his pistol into his partner's head. His partner, weapon already gone, retaliated to his best with a sudden wild punch straight to the man's face. The crack of a nose being broken said that had to hurt. The two men tousled for a moment before eating several blasts from kindness and Cupid at close range, charge shot after charge shot slamming into the two and throwing both back into the fog. They hit someone else on their way out, but by that time they were well past their pain threshold and had slipped into unconsciousness. Ronin himself disappeared as soon as he was done, holstering the gun and making a move back toward the nearest support beam to ascend once again. With a huge beam going up into the air, it was one of the easiest things to see in spite of the smoke if you knew to look for it. Ronin easily ascended the steel beam, partially with sheer climbing and partially with Beowulf's push quirk letting him stick to the thing. Using that quirk he could rest against the pillar, finding enough confidence to stop on the side of the beam instead of climbing all the way back to the top. His eyes scanned the smoke, finding new targets to chase as he drew more air knives from his jacket. It was a lot harder to throw them mid-climb, but with enough attempts they could regularly find their targets while he made his move. Two such needles descended from on high, striking a Yakuza in the shoulder and forearm. He spun about face, turning to face whatever attacked him and emptying his entire magazine into the rafters right before Ronin tackled him from beneath, lifting the Yakuza up off the ground just to slam him back down even harder. Ronin shoved the Yakuza into the ground and unloaded on him, pouring punch after punch into the Yakuza while pressing down to smother him. The Yakuza's gun was nearly useless at such close range, where he couldn't even bring it to point at the vigilante between getting his head slammed into the cement floor. Ronin grabbed the Yakuza's head to firmly slam it down, putting as much power out as he could to keep the larger man down as quickly as he could. 1, 2, 3 hits before he was really staying down. Ronin would have given him a fourth to really make sure of it if he didn't have to suddenly dodge, jumping back and sitting a few steps to avoid the giant arms that nearly turned both him and the guy on the floor into one big pancake. A Yakuza with arms that looked like they belonged on a gorilla instead of a human grinned devilishly at Ronin through the smoke, rising to meet the vigilante who quickly regained his footing. He opened his arms as a clear provocation, daring the vigilante to try his luck. Ronin looked him over once and decided that he would try his luck, stepping back in with hands raised to throw one punch and some pocket sand into the man's eyes. The man hadn't even tried to dodge the punch, instead countering with one of his own right until the mix of sand, salt, and peppers hit his face. Once the burning sensation kicked in, all bets were off. What the Yakuza tried to do as he screamed and flailed, his once powerful punch turning into larger, easier to dodge sweeping strikes. Ronin backed off immediately, building distance before backing into another Yakuza and throwing him at the gorilla. No way was he going to try and compete with what he wasn't good at in the first place. Sitting back and reveling in the chaos was more his style. Ronin watched the Yakuza struggle against each other, the thrown one shouting a few protests before being accidentally swatted aside. There were still a few Yakuza around in the smoke, so he decided to make the most of it before the smoke fully dissipated. Ever chivalrous, Ronin drew kindness and shot the ape-armed Yakuza in the back from 30 feet away before diving behind another Yakuza and giving him a good kick to make some noise. Ever vigilant, Monkey Man came charging in the direction he felt the attack come from, nearly flattening Ronin with his massive tackle and sending Ronin's meat shield packing. For his good behavior, the big-armed Yakuza ate several more powerful shots as Ronin continued to run away, the honorable hero he was. Ronin led the Yakuza around the warehouse, continually getting to a higher vantage to get new targets before shooting the massive man in the face to lead him back on. Together, this new heroic duo managed to almost completely eliminate the Yakuza still conscious in the warehouse. Strangely enough, Ronin's human monkey battering ram was getting tired towards the end of it, as if all his massive punches and shots to the face had drained him of most of his energy. Who'd have thunk it? With only 2 Yakuza left, Ronin did the nice thing and dropped from the rafters onto the Yakuza's head, drop-kicking the man face first into the support beam. The thud from that one reverberated through the warehouse almost as much as the flashbang had as the 2 Yakuza standing dwindled down to 1. 1 prisoner and 12 bodies, trapped in a tiny piece of hell with 1 monster. The dust settled and the smoke slowly cleared, showing the messy inside of warehouse J. Tap. Tap, tap, boxes smashed, bodies strewn about the loading zone, and a single man hobbling to the exit. Tap, tap, tap. His leg felt weak, his body was bruised, but he made it. The last Yakuza standing had made it to the back door. Tap, tap, tap. He leaned against the wall for support, using one arm to hold himself up while the other pried the lock bar off. Tap, tap, tap. Once the lock bar was free, the man fell against the door, taking a second to breathe, but he could still hear it. Tap, tap, tap. Slowly the man lifted his head off the door, pushing off to turn himself and look down the long alley of shelves at that wretched thing. Tap, tap, tap. It crawled toward him with slow, deliberate steps, cutting through the silence with each footfall. A casual yet powerful walk as it moved straight towards him down the alley, its monstrous features glinting in the refracted light. Tap, tap, tap. A head with no shape faced him, stared straight through him as it approached, towering over him. His legs shook as its claws twitched, sharp nails tensing quickly. Tap, tap, tap. He had a hand on the lock which he put all his strength into, trying to get it to budge as he pushed against it but the lock wouldn't move. The Yakuza scarcely moved his eyes as he tugged on the lock a second then third time, but there was no escape. Tap, tap, tap. He couldn't bear to look, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The monster drew closer at its slow steady pace as he flailed, trying with all his might to get the door to budge, but it just wouldn't move. Bang. Ronin hit the last Yakuza with a charged shot from kindness, still looking around the area to make sure this really was the last one. Didn't want anyone to be hiding among the shipping crates or other junk around here. Ronin only holstered kindness when he was sure the last man was really unconscious, lifting the last criminal to put by the rest. Mao is definitely done by now, so they should meet up to try and scan the rest of the area. Midoriya dropped the man off with the others and returned to the exit, pulling open the already unlocked back door then heading out front to find, to no one's surprise, Mao was still fucking around with the Yakuza. Midoriya only took 2 minutes to get rid of all his Yakuza, and he'd taken the slow method. But there was that giant dumbass, having some sort of wrestling competition with one of the Yakuza. Mao was locked hand in hand against some sort of centaur, laughing as his opponent tried to use his 4-legged stout muscle mouse too. If he could just push Mao back, the giant vigilante would be off balance and maybe he could make his escape. Mao had spent years fighting though, and he wasn't about to be pushed back just by muscle. Mao dug into the ground, pushing up while his foe pushed down and just cemented Mao's position further. He wasn't planning on budging an inch, and instead, he planned to take a few. Mao suddenly let his arms go slack as he pushed forward, headbutting his opponent with the fancy mask he'd been given. The horns of his mask smashed into his opponent's forehead, drawing blood as they broke skin and leaving the Yakuza to snarl in pain before Mao and him went into another hard push against each other. Bang, bang, bang. Or at least, they might have if Ronin hadn't come along and shot Mr. Little Pony 3 times in the side, honorable gentleman that he was. I had that guy. Mao pointed accusingly at his partner while Yakuza ran up behind him, dashing in with a small knife to shank the giant only to eat the massive man's backhand. If you had your way, you'd have him for another year at least. Ronin spun kindness on a finger before grabbing it with both hands and putting a few shots into the real last Yakuza. Probable backquote, but it'd be one hell of a year. Mao kicked the would-be shanker off the ground, grabbing him by the arm to then slam him against the truck, forcing the punk to drop his little knife before eating one final punch and going down. Dat it. Not even close. Ronin pulled out his bag of zip ties, getting to business while describing the next steps with his big bud. We bagged these guys, then we got a few more warehouses to check out. 4 more, but some are kinda far so they might not know anything's going down yet. 4 more. Sheet man, and backquote I thought we was worried about backup. The first one's locked up tight. Midoriya pointed out the next target, Warehouse K. It was the next door neighbor to the warehouse he'd just cleaned out, J, and had a few suspicious people working the truck before the vigilante duo arrived. That one sent out a few people to the truck, but most seem bolstered up in there. I want to crack them open before those reinforcements get here. Midoriya knew they were running out of time, but he also knew one warehouse that should be packed full of illegal shit. That warehouse could wait since it wasn't like the Yakuza could move it quickly. Speaking of quickly, Mao and Ronin didn't take their time as they showed some hustle and ran to Warehouse K. Big metal shutter door, locked up tight. Mao gave it a few hearty knocks to check, but that shit wasn't budging. Ronin took his usual up and over approach, circling about the place to check the doors while checking for runners. It didn't look like any of the Yakuza had bolted, but the doors were all shut tight. This place seemed to be a pretty hard nut to crack. Wanna bust through? Mao heard Ronin's report and focused on the big shutter door. It was big and thick, sure, but it was on sliders. Mao was confident he could bust it down with enough hits. Could be a fun use for that energy quirk he never really practiced with tilde, backup, remember? Sheet. With that Yakuza backup on the way, they had no time to waste trying to break through a steel door. Besides, just busting through a door. That's too normal. Ronin shook his head in mock despair. Tons of heroes do that all the time, at least get a little creative. Come on, man. Well, we could try ramming backquote truck through, bu backquote dat wheel looks pretty fucked. Mao looked at the crashed moving truck the Yakuza had tried to flee with, eyeing that front wheel with skepticism. Sure, he could drive it, but that didn't mean he'd like it. Ronin stared blankly at Mao for a second, drawing kindness to gesture vaguely upward. Mao followed his gaze above the warehouse's main steel shutter door to the glass window. Oh, Mao looked up, thinking it over as his smile grew. Oh, ooh Tilda. Wanna give me a hand up? Ronin switched magazines from air bullets back to real ones, thinking over just how much power he'd need to break the window cleanly while Mao put the cannibal on his back, freeing up his arms. Mao smiled as he walked behind the big bad Ronin, placing one hand on the vigilante's jacket right under the neck and getting a good grip as he lifted his smaller teammate up. Though you'd never ask Tilda. Wait, Hunter. Midoriya had just a moment to sputter before he was lifted off the ground completely by Mao, sparing a second to sure up his aim while he pulled his throwing arm back. Hunter. M-A-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U. It was a good thing Midoriya was so small, cause by God could that kid get some distance. Chapter end notes. Yo, we did it. We're at the end of chapter 199 and it's only chapter 201. This is definitely great time management, and no I don't have a problem shut up. Wasn't sure how much fighting is too much fighting, cause we're in for a string of a lot of smaller fights back to back, so here's where I guess I practice doing a few spacers to give everyone some time to breathe. All emphasis is no emphasis after all, so we need some small breaks to adjust to the stuff that's just happened. Speaking of stuff that just happened, the fights, and more specifically, the teamwork. I'll talk teamwork first cause it's easier and then double back for the fights themselves later. Ronin and Mao's teamwork, as two people who usually fight on their own, is terrible and it certainly wasn't going to become good anytime soon. I'd go so far as to say they're not fighting together, they're just cooperating still. I tried to show this by keeping them separate by their own choice, letting each fight in their own way with very little interaction. Ironically this chapter ends on the most interaction they've had, Mao setting up how the next fight is gonna start and giving us a little behind the scenes look at the setup behind the big end of chapter moment in 199. The most they interact in combat is helping finish of each other's fights, something that barely requires interacting or coordinating together since they have barely any group coordination. Then it became about when and where to show the group coordination, like those spacers I mentioned earlier. The small breaks I came up with were the planning moments after each fight. Ronin and Mao finish a fight, take a second to reflect, then plan their next move. This puts both of them on the same page and forces them to think of how they're going to use each other, like Mao flexing his confidence and ability to be bait while Ronin tries to fight in a more confined area so his skills can shine. The fighting itself is the next topic, but I don't think there's much to say about it at this point. Ronin's fighting style has always been to exploit opportunities, and the biggest improvement he can easily make is getting better at making the opportunities he exploits. Taking on a few goons in a straight fight is good, but give him some cover and a little wiggle room and he'll go a lot further. I'm guessing that's why it's so hard to figure out what Ronin's actual skill level is, since he's always punching above his weight class but winning with tricks and cheating. Ronin is a lot weaker than most of the people he fights, and even with his bodysuit he's nothing truly amazing. He's still weaker than anyone with super strength, slower than anyone with super speed, and frailer than anyone with super sturdiness. Super toughness, endurance, you get the idea. But Ronin is faster than most people with super strength, stronger than most people with super speed, and super endurance is nothing against Ronin's shenanigans and weapon variety. Maybe Ronin's real superpower is cheating. Mao's fighting style is designed to be the exact opposite of Ronin as the genuine article, someone who doesn't need gimmicks to win and fight straightforward. He doesn't need to use surprise to win, he just needs to play to his strengths. I don't think Mao's fighting style is as interesting to write as Ronin's because it's so much more simple, but it does make an interesting contrast and hopefully I can better weave them together. One of the big reasons that Mao and Ronin don't fight together is that I don't think I've got the chops to tie one fight with both of them together, but hopefully this dual fight style gives me some practice before the real thing. Guess Ronin and Mao aren't the only ones learning about team fighting. That's about all the bad ideas I can fit into one chapter though, so time to bail. Thanks for reading and hope to catch ya on the flip side, now adios amigos. Chapter 202, Caught Up and Catching Hands. Chapter Summary. Midoriya and Mao do some actual teamwork besides fighting in the same room as each other and thus run into a few team problems. Turns out group fighting isn't that easy. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. M-A-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U-U. Midoriya screamed as he hurtled up, thrown far faster and harder than he would have liked by Mao straight at the next warehouse's window. The kid barely had time to control his flight, getting his arms in front of him to brace, activating Beowulf's pull on all four limbs, gritting his teeth before. Thunk Tilda. Midoriya splatted below the warehouse's central giant window, resembling more a bug on a windshield than a gracefully infiltrating vigilante. He stuck to the metallic exterior for a moment, held fast by the force of his face kissing the wall before starting to peel off. Midoriya was dazed for a second, his head aching from some dickhead throwing him at a wall, but he was used to getting his shit rocked and quickly fastened his grip on the warehouse wall. With all four limbs against the metallic wall he stopped his slide, hanging onto the wall like some kind of insect or spider. His falling stopped, Midoriya spared a second to glare back at the dick who threw him up here. Hey, genius, I could get up here myself you know. That genius was looking up from below with a head to his hand and a smile under his mask, cause even if Midoriya couldn't see his face Mao was definitely smirking right now. Yeah, but my method's faster. Besides, how ya doing back with that? Mao waved a hand in general at Midoriya's posture as Midoriya took in what he was doing for the first time. Midoriya hung from the wall by all four limbs, hanging there with just the power of Beowulf and its pull quirk. He knew the quirk was strong, but strong enough to lift his entire body against a flat sheet of metal. Somebody really should have tested his equipment more. Quote. It's complicated look, are you gonna come up here or not? Midoriya brushed past it, making a mental note that he definitely would have to test his equipment a little more extensively later, but he was kind of in the middle of something right now. Yee, one of ya fank items. Mao rolled his eyes, taking a few steps back and overlooking the shutter door, a climber planning his route up. We just bustin' through and talkin' am all out gain. That's the plan. Midoriya fiddled with his gauntlets, cautiously pulling one hand back to slowly pry it off the wall. It was like his hand was covered in tar, but once he pried about half of it off, the hand came off the wall suddenly. It was like moving a suction cup, the problem was all in the start. But there was probably an easier way than just forcing his hands off. Midoriya turned off his gauntlet, placing it higher on the wall before turning it back on. He then turned off his other glove and moved it up, starting to scale the wall with small steps. Hup. Mao gave one shout to motivate himself as he ran at the shutter door, kicking off it to gain height before grabbing the top ledge of the door. One glance up, one man up, and the main man was already almost to the large window. Not to be beaten, Midoriya got a move on, running before he could climb, or so to speak. With Beowulf Midoriya didn't have to find things to grab, almost anything could be a climbing hold. Beowulf let him advance window and hung by three limbs, shoring up each limb's grip before going for his piece. 3, 2. The countdown was the only warning before Ronin put 3 charged shots into the glass, creating a cascade of glass before the 2 vigilantes pulled themselves through the window and into their next fight. The glass cascaded down as the criminals stared up, hiding behind some sort of makeshift barricade. The barricades covered all the exits, ensuring that nobody was leaving early. Explained why there were no runners and made this next part even easier. It's them. The Yakuza were in bunches, armed but unguarded as they stared up at the intruders. It seemed they were spellbound as they stared in a mix of horror and awe at the intruders until one broke the silence and spoke. They're here. There were no catwalks this time, so Ronin and Mao went straight from the windowsill to the ground. Mao slid along the top of a metallic box, riding it along before pushing off of it and straight into the pack of sheep. Ronin jumped from perch to perch, always keeping both feet under him before pouncing straight onto his own prey. It's Hunter and Ronin. Those were the only words to be said before the 2 vigilantes crashed into the villains. Mao literally ran straight into the horde of Yakuza, smashing several with a clothesline as an opening before directing his attacks any and everywhere. He had no focus, he needed no focus, smashing straight through everyone despite their best effort. Massive hits slammed through people, knocking them into each other as Mao used his body to the fullest as the weapon it could be. Ronin struck out against the biggest guy he could find, jumping off the barricade to land on top of him and knocking him to the floor while slamming kindness into his skull. The large man was thrown back and then toppled by the sudden weight hitting his head, and before he could so much as try to raise a guard he was lying on the floor and already fading in and out of consciousness with a massive pain forming across the head. Yakuza moved in to attack Ronin, focused on one opponent, but Ronin pushed them all back by raising kindness and firing it once into the floor. Bang creak. The bullet ricocheted off the stone floor, skirting off the ground, the wall, then up into the rafters, far from actually hitting any of the Yakuza but still causing them to jump back in fear and pain, fear from being shot and pain from the incredible noise confined to that tiny warehouse. But as even Ronin winced a little at the gunshot, Mao pushed on. With his height this high, he wouldn't be slowed down by something as weak as that, and certainly not as weak as these Yakuza bitches. The main man plowed his way through the Yakuza as they pushed back, striking as they flinched to crack open their guards and sending them flying. His hits were heavy, sending whatever he hit reeling backward while he powered on. Even if whatever he hit didn't stay down, they barely had a chance to recover before the walking tornado hit them again. And if they didn't get him, they got the Revenant. Revenant had finished his first target and now preyed on Mao's scraps, a scavenger circling round and round. Mao bodied 2 men with a sweeping kick, and before they could even think of getting up he was there. Anyone could go down, but with Revenant there, no one would be getting up. Revenant switched kindness for Tenbokiri, the lightning spear he used to jab and strike from a distance. A Yakuza hit the ground, rolled to his feet, then charged back and eat the tail end of Tenbokiri to the face. He pulled back as Ronin stepped in from the side, switching to Tenbokiri's main end and jabbing the man in the chest. Revenant switched ends again as the man tried to power through, sidestepping and striking with Tenbokiri's tail before jabbing him in the back while a second Yakuza circled about, eager to focus on the armed Yakuza while he was distracted. The Yakuza stepped up, two-handed his sword as he swung for Revenant's head. Revenant quickly tried to pivot, using Tenbokiri's shaft to block. CR-back. But before the Yakuza's swing could even get some real momentum, a massive wooden bat came right under his guard and crushed his ribs, then continued straight on to launch him backward like a baseball. Mao barely stopped to gloat at Ronin before continuing, now using the kanabo in his fists at once. He twisted his body around another charging Yakuza, hitting the fucker in the back with the pommel from the right, then a backhand from the left before bringing the entire kanabo down on the poor fucker. Ronin shook his head at Mao's antics before turning back himself, first flicking Tenbokiri's tail into the next Yakuza's weapon to knock it aside to then slam the shaft into the man's stomach. He doubled over before Tenbokiri swept his legs out from under him, sending him tumbling to the floor to be electrocuted by Tenbokiri's blade. Mao elbowed his next victim to build distance before kicking him in the chest, then pivoting to his next target to face him head-on. The next Yakuza slammed a pipe into his ribs, but all it could do was dent against the main man's full enthusiasm before Mao repaid the favor with his kanabo, showing the fucker what a real weapon looked like. The main stumbled back, clutching his ribs but managing to keep his feet under him before Ronin sprung out from behind him and kicked him right back toward Mao. Mao smiled as he lined up his next shot, dropping into a batter's stance. Feet shoulder width apart, bat on the shoulder, step in as the bitch approaches, and swing tilde. CR-back. The Yakuza was sent flying by that hit, feet not even touching the ground straight into Ronin before he could even get a chance to dodge. Ronin had started to engage his next opponent when from out of left field a whole ass man crashed into him, rocking the vigilante and sending both the human fastball and the accidental catcher flying, dropping Tenbokiri along the way. My bad. Mao hollered suddenly to his companion before picking up with Ronin's last opponent, grabbing him from behind by the neck to slam him into the ground and stomp on him, then pivoting to take care of the next Yakuza who ran forward. My bad, no shit, Sherlock. Ronin landed on his back, still entangled with the Yakuza, but he quickly kicked up and onto his feet with a backflip, moving in and giving the human fastball one last punt to the ribs before moving back into the fight, heading for Tenbokiri. The Yakuza scurried though, grabbing the spear first and pointing it confidently at the vigilante with a look of triumph. How do you like me now, runt? Ronin answered by drawing Cupid and shooting the man once in the face, then walking forward while he flinched to grab Tenbokiri by the shaft. Still hate you. The Yakuza tried to wrestle the spear free while Ronin activated Beowulf on 3 limbs, anchoring himself to the floor and Tenbokiri to his hand while the Yakuza struggled, pulling this way and that before taking a small breather and getting shot in the face again. God, the man opened his mouth and ate another point-blank shot from Cupid, but this time Ronin pulled him forward and smashed the side of his head with Cupid, sending the Yakuza crashing to the floor and finally dropping Tenbokiri. Watch your fucking language. Ronin turned to look at Mao, facing off with the last 3 Yakuza. Close quarters, everyone seemed pretty involved. Mao would be fine. Ronin charged up a shot with Cupid before shooting Mao in the back, creating a massive blast that hit both the main man and all 3 Yakuza. Hey. My bad. Ronin didn't even try to sound genuine as he walked over, holstering kindness to use Tenbokiri with both hands. Once he had a good grip he moved in, charging with his weight behind the spear to make sure it would hurt. Mao recovered the fastest from being shot. He barely felt it other than the sudden shove and forced his way out from between the 3 Yakuza, taking 2 on at the same time like he preferred. He kicked one in the chest to throw him back, then turned to slam the kanabo into the other. It missed, but the Yakuza dived back in order to make it miss, giving Mao some room to work with. Mao took that inch and ran with it, moving towards his first prey with a low kick before pivoting back to the second and swinging the kanabo again. It missed again as the Yakuza jumped back, but as long as it built distance the kanabo was still doing something. Mao really wanted to hit something with it again though, so he turned his mist swing into a massive arc that ended straight on his already downed opponent, cracking ribs and getting a good scream before turning back and actually putting some power into his swing. The second Yakuza had advanced again, this time trying to block the Kanabo with his own weapon. Metal pipe met wooden Kanabo to snap in half, leaving the Yakuza holding the world's dumbest looking shiv while Mao stepped up with a real weapon. Well, would a backquote look at that. Both men took a second to look at the snapped metal pole, pondering it for a second. Mao sucker punched the Yakuza, knocking him out cold before his guard could even come up. The third one probably would have stepped in if he hadn't gotten rammed from the side by Ronin and Tenbokiri, both breaking his ribs and tasing him at the same time. The tasing only lasted a second, didn't want any serious damage after all, but the follow-up tail strike to the man's temple still put him out like a light. Ronin took a slight step back, checking the surroundings one last time while Mao had his fun breaking that last Yakuza's weapon and then punching him. 24 odd Yakuza lying on the floor. Nobody reaching for weapons, nobody trying to get up. The fight seemed over. Midoriya relaxed, pulling his spear apart while he moved to overlook the mess, still surveying to make sure he didn't miss any Yakuza trying to pull something. How ya doing? Mao crouched over his last two victims, giving each a nudge before coming back to his feet. Pretty good. Didn't backquote see any gunners this time, so it was smooth sailing backquote. Yeah, I know. I took care of them. The guns are over here if you want them. The spear was easy to pull apart, but actually putting it back in the coat was a lot harder and slower than getting it out. Midoriya finally finished it though and brought out his second favorite weapon, the bag of zip ties. Thank ya Tilda and backquote how ya doing? Looked like you got fucking backquote nailed. Mao tried to sound genuine, but he was definitely laughing at the thought, still remembering the sight of Midoriya going flying as an entire guy smashed into him. Little sore, but I'll walk it off. Catch. Midoriya tossed one of his oh-so special bags to Mao as he began to move the Yakuza together, minding the broken glass still scattered on the floor that everyone seemed content to ignore during their fight. He better make sure nobody got impaled anywhere vital, fast. I figured. Hey man, you walk off fucking backquote bullets, what the fuck was some guy gonna do? Mao showed that he at least remembered what Midoriya said, even if he was just trying to cover for his big fuck up. Still, the thought had to count for something. Break my neck, maybe. Midoriya mumbled his complaints, but what was done was done. Midoriya carried the Yakuza off the floor to avoid the glass shards, placing the next one out of the broken glass while still checking for any big wounds. You got the time. Backquote bout. Forta backquote 2. Mao checked his phone, carrying two of the Yakuza over with one arm while Midoriya was doing his best with just one at a time. Dat means this took about 2 minutes. We should be expecting reinforcements soon, and probably the heroes a little after that. Midoriya kept moving the bodies, checking the area for any big injuries to patch before zip-tying everyone and carrying them away. Damn, we might only have time for one more raid. How mana backquote you got left again? 2. So close, 2. Midoriya thought over his info on the next two targets. One he was sure had Yakuza activity inside, Warehouse I, and one he was pretty sure had Yakuza, Warehouse M. So far all his guesses about Yakuza hideouts had been right, but he probably shouldn't risk it and go for the one he was sure about. Gotcha, I'll take one and backquote you take the backquote. Mao didn't even bother with Midoriya's quandaries by offering the obvious solution. Sure, they had been moving together to be more efficient, but strictly speaking they didn't need to. Midoriya had done dozens of raids similar to this before and even if Mao hadn't it wasn't exactly rocket science. Go some spare cuff things. How are you going through so many? Midoriya more so wondered why he didn't think of that but kept his thoughts to himself as he checked his stash, then chucked another bag near Mao before picking up his last Yakuza. You sure? PFF. Dat da main man can beat da shit out of some more chuckle fucks. Mao patted his chest with pride, dropping the Yakuza he was carrying like a sack of rocks. I got this. Midoriya stared at the Yakuza, unsure if he was alright until he groaned. Good enough at least. Quote. Right, sure you are. Warehouse M, should be closer to where we came in, a little. It's got a big fat off M on da side. Mao cut him off with a dismissive wave, shooing him out. I done backquote need no directions. Hell, betcha I get done before you. Since Mao might be going to a warehouse with no Yakuza, that bet was pretty safe. But Midoriya was going just across the way to sabotage what could be an entirely empty warehouse himself. After all, throughout the entire commotion over the last 10 minutes, Warehouse I hadn't budged an inch. While Midoriya had good intel, it was run by the Yakuza. Would there actually be anyone in there right now? Quote. Loser buys dinner. Midoriya's stance became a little steadier as he moved out of his thoughts and back into reality. Meet at da bike. Mao met Midoriya's calm with his usual confidence, still rocking a dumb smile so big you could actually see parts of it peeking out from behind his mask. God, that mask was tiny on Mao. Midoriya looked to the ceiling, weighing up how he felt. Little sore from Mao's home run, but otherwise pretty good. He was warmed up, in good form, and had enough power in his kit to take on some serious problems. Ronin's gaze came down, his own smile matching Mao's as he turned towards the window as his exit. You're on. Chapter and notes. Yo, a smaller chapter to show chapter 199's fight past Ronin and Mao's entrance, and with this small chapter done we finally finished the last flash forward and we're back to the main timeline. Not sure if you can really call flash forwards and flashbacks, timeline, stuff, but I'm pretty dumb so I can say some real stupid stuff with a straight face. Ronin and Mao are finally coming together to do some real teamwork, past just fighting in the same room as each other. We got one moment where they help each other and one moment where they get in each other's way to try and show that, while they're good, two goods doesn't always equal a great. Mao's powerful defense means he doesn't usually have to pay attention to his surroundings, while Ronin's flashy array of big weapons that can usually hit multiple enemies at once also risk hitting his allies. Guess someone's gotta cut back on the flashbangs and smoke grenades for a bit. Once we get past the team attacks that Shonen seems to love though we get to use another team-up tactic. Splitting up. I mean, it sounds dumb, but if you've got two competent people mowing through a whole bunch of incompetent people you might just be wasting your resources a little. Also, that hunter guy the Yakuza keep talking about. That's about it, just a quick little chapter to start that good teamwork before the Yakuza raid arc wraps up. Man, the Yakuza arc in the anime seemed a little more dramatic, but I might be remembering it wrong. Oh well, I'm sure it's nothing. Adios amigos. Chapter 203, Lights. Chapter Summary. Camera. Chapter Notes. Action. See the end of the chapter for more notes. There were many commotions in the Shizuoka prefecture at one time. A prefecture is a large place, covering several cities, each city with its own problems. But at least one problem was wrapping to a close. In some batch or warehouses stuck between a few cities so close, it was hard to say past taxes where it really belonged. Midoriya and Mao did one final pass over the Yakuza they'd beaten, making sure everyone was tied up nice and pretty before both quietly heading back out the way they came in. Back over the mess of broken glass they had made, up over the Yakuza's makeshift blockade, and down through the window they blew apart to get into the warehouse, silent all the way to the ground before giving each other a final look. Meet at the bike when we're done. Midoriya took one last chance to go over the rules, seeming calm but still playing with the katana at his hip, left hand constantly tapping a beat into it to give away his real thoughts. He didn't expect resistance, but it was best to be ready with his strongest weapon. Last one dear's a bitch. Mao kept it steady with his own big flashy moves, slamming his fist into his palm over and over like he was getting pumped, but the lack of tension in his legs showed just how comfortable he was. He might even try using that weird bat thing Midoriya had given him on the next Yakuza he found. Then see you later, bitch boy. Midoriya said it with a weight truly unfitting such a stupid name, but it was the siren as both vigilantes took off in different directions across the facility at full speed, eager to get out of paying for dinner. And if they just happened to show the other up at the same time. Midoriya ran across the warehouse lot, eyes flicking to each giant letter as he searched for his target. Midoriya and Mao were both moving to maybe targets, places they weren't sure they'd have a real fight. Mao's warehouse, M, might not have even been a real Yakuza warehouse while nobody could be in Midoriya's. He started at warehouse J, so warehouse I should be close. What idiot sorted these things? With warehouse I so close to the warehouses the action had been happening in theory, someone should have noticed the commotion and come out to help. The second and third warehouses had noticed when the first was attacked, so why wouldn't I? Midoriya found it by pulling back and up, climbing atop a warehouse to get a larger view of the scene. Far side of the road, locked up all tight with no one in sight, warehouse I. The most likely reason warehouse I didn't send anyone was that nobody was in it. As Midoriya approached the target building, jumping from roof to roof with his suit's enhanced strength and catching himself with Beowulf's claws, warehouse's dim interior and still frame were easy to see. If nobody was in it, there'd be nobody to stop him. He'd just check to make sure there was some illegal stuff in there, make sure it was obvious, then set off some of the explosives he'd stolen from the very Yakuza he was harassing today. The bet would be in the bag. But if someone was in there, well, Midoriya didn't collect all these flashbangs just because they looked cool. Midoriya crept along the top of warehouse I, not bothering to try the doors. If the Yakuza knew how to lock up their stuff in case of an attack, there was no chance that they'd leave their warehouses unlocked with no security measures. So Midoriya moved quietly over the roof, planning his entry. Should he go 3 for 3 with that big window over the main shutter door? This warehouse had the same flaw as the others, the same flaw as every warehouse in the place. One giant window was positioned over top warehouse's largest door, the kind used for trucks to load and unload their wares. While the warehouse's security was good, nobody had planned for high-powered firearms. Even still, it usually took multiple bullets just to get through one window. Even with Revenant's limited knowledge of guns and gun-resistant objects, that seemed impressive. Midoriya moved along the top of the warehouse, quietly but quick to not lose his speed edge to Mao. His target might be empty, judging by the quiet of the building and the absence of light, but Mao could be moving towards some totally abandoned warehouse himself that wasn't even connected to the Yakuza in any way. Caution was good and all, but there were things to be said about speed too. Midoriya crossed the top of the warehouse, stopping in its midsection at a skylight and giving the massive window a quick tap. A skylight, a simple and cheap way to provide lighting inside the warehouse without having to worry about the electric bill. Made of some thick glass, too, probably the same as the main window he'd been breaking through in the last warehouses. Midoriya looked through it, past the grime of the window to the dark shelves and shadows of the warehouse itself. The warehouse was full of boxes, shelves, and dust, but none of those were what Midoriya had been worried about. Sure, Midoriya would be worried if a warehouse he was sure of being stocked full of illegal things turned up completely empty, but then he could just write it off. Instead, the lack of people caught his attention more than any surplus of packages. He carefully moved around the skylight, checking every nook and cranny, but inside the warehouse there were no lights, no movement, and no apparent people. While Midoriya did like being careful, there was a difference between caution and slow. While the bet was a good way to force him to get a move on, reinforcements for the Yakuza should be on their way, and no doubt this wasn't the only time he'd break into somewhere that seemed shady. Checking that he still had his best weapon on hand, Ronin only tapped Muramasa once with his left before nodding to himself, rising from a crouch beside the skylight to draw his gun and take aim. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots and he was in, sliding past the broken glass. Revenant jumped from the skylight's edge to the shelving units, catching himself on one pillar to jump to the next, all the way down to the ground floor. Revenant landed with his usual roll, tucking everything in before springing up with his eyes peeled and weapon ready. If the warehouse seemed empty from the outside, it seemed downright barren from the inside. Most of the boxes were stored on the higher levels of the metal shelves, with no sign of any equipment or personnel to get them up so high. Revenant turned in place, the glass shards crunching under his feet as he took in the dark scenery. No sign of movement so far. His eyes still adjusting to the dark interior, Revenant moved towards the nearest box, a cardboard package with a few stamps on it. Using just his gauntlet he cut the tape holding it together, opening the box up and removing the packaging to check the goods. Quote ... Hey, inside the box were sets of cigarettes, purple cigarettes from a long time ago. Took him right back to his first raid, when he went up against a few small-time gangs. One of the gangs he'd fought were drug runners, and they had been marketing cigarettes themselves. To make sure they were the same, Revenant lifted one of the cigarette packs out of the box, holding it up in the dim light as he read the label. Toxic lovers. So, those dumbasses were backed by the Yakuza. The toxic lovers were the first real crime Ronin had taken on, and the first crime unit he really put down. If these Yakuza had gotten a hold of this stuff, it was likely they were either behind the small gang or had taken over their operations once Ronin had moved them out of the picture. Tap, tap, tap. Revenant noticed the sound of footsteps immediately, turning slightly to face the direction while still holding onto the cigarette pack. His eyes squinted in the dark, trying to adjust as someone approached. Tap, tap, tap. He came into the skylight's distorted light quietly save for the tread of his Oxford shoes on the concrete floor, the white of his suit catching the light well. Tap, tap, tap. The man wore some kind of white suit coat over a black ensemble, dressed to the nines. Upon closer inspection, the tap didn't come from his shoes, but from his cane as he struck the ground with every step. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping stopped with the man as he paused, looking over the vigilante as the vigilante looked over him. The man had a few more details about him, a small, yet stupid-looking fancy hat along with some sort of scarf tied around his neck. The most striking detail about him was his face, or rather his lack of one. Covering the man's face was something resembling a red screen, glowing brightly in the dark with a soft flicker like an old computer monitor and completely concealing his face. They each took one look over the other, eyes meeting beneath their respective masks. Would you be the last samurai? The overly dressed figure asked, posture so proper yet bad it was utterly unbefitting a Yakuza. He walked so properly before suddenly leaning all his weight on his cane, pushing forward as if to peer closer at Ronin. His outfit was so gaudy yet underspoken, it felt like it didn't belong to a real Yakuza. Love the duds, but the color tilde couldn't you wear something other than dull gray, or is it as bright as your imagination? Ronin. Ronin dropped the cigarettes back into the box, fully turning to face his opponent with some real posture as he put up his guard. One leg was forward, closer to his opponent as his left hand gently but firmly grasped Muramasa's sheath. He didn't waste time with words, instead sizing up his opponent. One man to guard a whole warehouse. How good was he? Ronin tilde can't say I've heard of you. The figure pulled back, keeping his posture fluid as he lifted his cane to rest against his shoulder while tapping his chin. Villain. Hero. Ronin said nothing as he gauged the distance again, trying to beat on his opponent. Poor posture, no guard whoever this guy was he was confident in his quirk, and until Ronin knew what that quirk was, he'd be at a disadvantage even if he moved first. He had to bait out the first attack. Vigilante. Edgy hero, got it tilde. The gaudy man dismissed Ronin's words with a wave of his hand, glancing around as if he was taking in the warehouse himself. You're late, no. Expected you forever ago, you're slacking. Slacking. Ronin was pushed back slightly by the man's words. So this jackass did hear the commotion when Ronin and Mao raided the other buildings, he just chose not to help anyone. The Yakuza really were the worst. And what are you supposed to be, some kind of guard dog who can't even help his teammates? Little ol backquote me. The villain placed a hand to his chest in mock surprise as he moved around the light, Ronin slowly moving towards him to close the distance as they both circled under the skylight. Please. I'm just a showman. The showman did a little bow, finally righting himself to the best posture he'd taken so far as he fully faced the vigilante. He flicked his free arm down, catching something out of his coat sleeve. But what's a showman without a show tilde? Ronin and showman both flickered at once, each throwing their respective weapons toward the other. A steel card and a knife made of solid air clashed between them, each thrown off by the other sailed, clattering into the shelving units unseen. Waiting no time, both men closed the distance between them. Ronin drew an additional air knife from his coat, stepping in with a few large cuts to try and gauge his opponent's defense. Showman strutted forward, keeping his cane against his shoulder as he moved past Ronin's knife and shoulder-checked the vigilante, driving his entire weight into the slightly larger man to knock him back into the shelving units. His guard broken, Ronin stumbled back, trying to keep his feet under him before crashing against shelves, regaining his balance for only a moment before sidestepping to avoid Showman's next attack. Showman hadn't wasted a moment, bringing his cane off his shoulder the moment Ronin's guard was gone to try and put a dent in the vigilante's skull. He gripped the cane with both hands, breaking the head of the cane down hard to smash down on Ronin, barely missing the live criminal by inches and instead crushing one of the boxes. Ronin pushed off the shelf to dodge Showman's attack, then came in from behind and slammed the criminal's face into that same shelf with a harsh thud. He pulled back, ready to slam the gaudy bitch into the shelf unit again when a sudden elbow jabbed him in the ribs. Showman didn't try to brute force his way out, feeling a hand suddenly grip the back of his head and thrust him towards the shelving. He brought up his guard, hitting the shelf arm first instead of face first and giving him enough clarity to turn the situation around. The edgy hero pulled back, trying to slam him into the shelf a second time, but the showman immediately snapped his elbow back and into his attacker's ribs, forcing him back a step. The pain was hardly noticeable, only a minor blip because of the shots Ronin had taken in the last fight, but the sudden elbow pushed Ronin off and gave Showman a second to breathe. With just 1 second the showman leaned onto the shelves, snapping a leg up to kick back Ronin further and build more distance. With proper room to move now, the showman pushed himself off the shelves just as Ronin hadn't advanced, working his right arm in small circles with a confident laugh. Now this is the fun part. You sure about that? Ronin stumbled only for a second as he activated Beowulf's boots, pulling himself into the ground and anchoring him to the spot. He leaned forward, his left hand pulling his sheath forward before pulling the trigger. Muramasa shot out of the sheath like a bat out of hell, flying forward into Showman's stomach with sudden violence. Showman's momentum was crushed before it could even begin, pushing him back as Ronin caught his sword out of the air and brought it down. Ronin made sure to turn the blade, bringing the flat down on Showman's skull, but instead met the showman's cane mid-stroke. The showman did take a heavy hit from Muramasa, the sword flying handle first into his stomach was a hard hit for almost anyone, but he didn't go down like Ronin did. His feet slid along the ground, his head came down, but his legs stayed on the ground and his arm stayed fluid. Even through the pain Showman focused, watching for the moment the sword swing would come, and when it did. TSSSSSSSSSSHK. Not bad. Sparks flew his sword met Kane, the showman rising to meet Ronin as he pushed off the ground while Ronin tried to press him down into it. Not bad at all, but not good either, and that was when the showman got serious. Ronin and the showman pulled back, taking their stances. Ronin held his sword in front of him to guard himself, leaning forward with both hands gripping Muramasa. His eyes narrowed as he tried to gauge his opponent, but it seemed impossible. The showman stood with a different confidence than Mao, his body relaxed while spinning his cane on a hand while slowly walking forward, one foot placed so delicately in front of the other. From the saunter of his steps to the spin of his cane, there was no doubt in the showman's presence who was the better. Violence. Ronin sprung forward, stepping in as he swung his sword overhead to cut the showman while the cane was spinning, putting his full weight into the swing as it careened down. TK. The showman adjusted the grip on his cane before cutting through the air, parrying the vigilante's slash. Ronin used his entire body for his leaping attack, the showman only used one arm to bring his cane up, meeting Muramasa mid-swing before gently guiding it to one side, all while stepping away with the rest of his body. The showman's parry pushed Muramasa clear of actually hitting anything, but this time the sword didn't sail so far. With less power, it didn't miss as far as it had before, so Ronin could begin the next attack sooner. Ronin used his entire body for the next attack, repositioning his body behind his sword instead of bringing his sword back to his body, and attacked from there. It wasn't necessarily faster this way, but it was unexpected. In Ronin's books, anyways. The showman barely batted an eye, arm and cane flicking in one fluid motion. This time the cane pushed Ronin's attack and guard both out of the way, giving the showman another chance to attack he didn't miss. The showman stepped in as Ronin stepped back, thrusting with his cane with Ronin still trying to recover his guard from the last parry. Ronin pulled his arms in tight, using them to try and block the thrust, but the cane slipped between his arms and gave him a sharp jab to the ribs, the same ribs he'd already been shot at and that had taken quite the beating today. Ronin pushed past the growing pain, instead realigning his guard. Now Ronin and his sword moved together, repositioning and meeting midway before coming out for his fastest attack yet. With his jab successful, the showman pulled back, flipping his cane to catch it by the end instead of the crook. He didn't pull back far though before Ronin's next slash came toward him, laughing before meeting him midway and holding the line. Sword and cane clashed, creating a few sparks as serrated edges scratched against strong steel. Damn! Excitement filled the showman's voice as they met in the middle, each pushing hard against their respective weapons. God damn! With the bodysuit and his training, Ronin was clearly stronger. He pushed against the showman, sure of his own abilities, but just as sure of the showman's abilities. That laugh wasn't a bluff, and it was stupid thoughts like most heroes or villains. The showman suddenly pulled his cane to the side, catching Muramasa in the crook of his cane to pull it aside and going shoulder to shoulder with Ronin as both wrestled for control over their weapons. Now this is a challenge. The showman suddenly thrust with his cane, smashing Ronin in the face with the head of his cane before wrapping the crook of it behind Ronin's neck. Shit. The showman yanked Ronin around, pulling him in before kicking him in the stomach to throw him back out. This is a real fight. Ronin tried to weave out from under the crook's grasp, but the crook moved with him to keep him firmly in place as the showman stepped up and spiked a knee towards Ronin's face. Ronin blocked it with his arms, crossing them in front of his face and catching the knee before stepping in while his opponent was off balance. The showman quickly returned to form, planting both feet as Ronin moved in closer to firm up his defense while grabbing his cane with both hands, then flicking the end up like Ronin had so many times with his spear. It was a sudden attack, but it still met Ronin's heavily guarded arms, the shaft of the cane landing only a glancing blow against his bracers as Ronin barely straightened into his opponent. The showman was forced back a step as Ronin went shoulder to shoulder with him, squared off like boxers and too close for their usual weapons to matter. The showman pushed against Ronin, trying to build enough distance for a real hit as he muttered to himself. Stubborn little. Bam. The showman was interrupted by a sudden hook to the body, Ronin having freed up one of his hands just to score that punch. Seeing it land, Ronin followed it up with a second, then a third. The showman tried to break it off, but at such a distance it was virtually impossible to shake the vigilant vigilante off. The showman was sure to try and come up with another snarky liner before a fourth hook hit him in the ribs, earning Ronin a growl. Some people are just too clingy. The showman spiked his leg up again, scoring a much weaker strike against Ronin that he could hardly feel through his armor, but then he wrapped his leg around Ronin's and suddenly elbowed his opponent upside the head. The elbow would have been easy to dodge if it weren't for the tangle of his legs, forcing Ronin to eat a heavy hit upside the head before getting shoved to the floor. Ronin splayed out on the concrete, nary a second to rub his aching head before moving to dodge the showman's follow-up attack. The showman gripped his cane with both hands, putting some power into his swing before bringing it down where Ronin had been a moment prior. Fuck. Ronin, seeing the incoming attack, did his best to avoid everything with what could only generously be called a roll, more so flopping out of the way as he built distance with the showman still on his tail. Given the sudden need for distance, Ronin pulled out his best weapon of all. A gun. Ronin managed to get 2 feet under him and an arm in his coat, fumbling for half a second as the showman drew near before pulling out kindness. Fuck. The showman's reaction was pretty subdued, suddenly surging forward with some actual effort in his steps as he closed the distance and struck with his cane. Ronin readied a shot, taking aim at the charging villain and firing just as the cane stiff batted his gun to the side. A blast of air shot off through the warehouse's shelving units, knocking over boxes and rattling the shelves as the showman moved in to knock the gun out of Ronin's hand proper. Before he could get that far, though, Ronin showed that he was packing more than just a little heat by drawing Cupid. Why the hell were you using throwing knives if you had these? The showman's tone was hard to make out if he was worried or excited, and Ronin hoped to God it was worried by this point. Ronin didn't let his worries slow him down though as he took aim with Cupid and fired again. Even as he took aim, the showman intercepted. He drew the gun from his coat as showman had been moving in for an attack, then suddenly switched to another parry. The roar of the gunshot alone was harsher than the air bullet from kindness, straining everyone's ears within the warehouse. A real physical bullet flew out of the gun, crashing into a shelving unit with enough force to rock it in spite of all the packages that had been kept on it. ... He never changed the magazines back when he entered the warehouse. Shit. No time for worries though as the showman and Ronin both stopped staring at the rocking shelving unit, focusing back on each other instead of the packages falling off the shelves and both pulling their weapons back up. Ronin barely had time to properly stand, so busy on focusing his guns in the direction if just to keep his opponent away. 2 targets were a lot harder to parry, near impossible it seemed. The showman could parry one easily enough just like he parried Ronin's sword strokes hitting either the gun itself or the arm holding it, but only one. As Ronin forced his feet under himself properly, the showman had to do some real acrobatics to stay out of reach of his guns. Showman's arm flicked to Cupid, pushing it skyward before the showman suddenly lurched the other way to avoid kindness's cruel kiss. Ronin pushed himself up with the shelf, using his legs and the shelf to take a real stance before lurching backward, hopping atop the lowest shelf to gain height then flipping over the showman, showering him with bullets as he arced over. The showman spun to the side, avoiding the initial spray before hitting Ronin with a thrusting pierce midair. The sudden jab knocked Ronin aside, forcing him to work to recover and disrupting his hail of real and air bullets. Ronin hit the ground with a roll, keeping a good grip on his guns as he flipped to his feet and spun on a dime, turning 180 degrees on a dime while skipping back one more step before planting his feet in a shooter's stance. 20 feet between them, more than even Ronin could cover in a dash, and this guy hadn't shown any signs of super speed. Feet planted shoulder width apart, Ronin leaned forward over his leading leg, pushing against Cupid while keeping his sights locked in. Ronin kept his gun trained on his opponent, putting all his focus into aiming Cupid. Both of them knew which gun packed the punch, so no point in trying to be coy. Show's over, so drop it. Ronin didn't want to kill. He knew damn well that if this gun shot at the showman, not even a curtain call would stop the splatter. He also knew that he couldn't afford to pull this punch, a lesson taught to him by Muscular. There were people out there who were so good he couldn't afford to play nice. Curtains already. The showman tilted his head at Ronin, thinking it over as he spun the cane on his finger. He seemed to glance at the sun through the skylight, nodding to himself. Ronin had taken too long. The reinforcements were definitely there. Now, as he stared down the sights of Cupid, the seconds seemed to stretch on as the showman's gaze flicked down. He didn't know how, but he could tell the showman was smiling. Then let's end it with a bang. The showman faced him head-on, smiling beneath his strange mask as he gripped his cane with a proper two-handed grip for the first time in the fight. His stance went as wide as Ronin's, mirroring and matching the vigilante as the cane came to rest against his shoulder. Even now his posture was entirely relaxed as he stared down the gun barrel, arguably more ready for what was coming than Ronin himself. Goodbye. Ronin glanced at his opponent, surprised, then steeled himself. The man had more balls than him, that was sure. His grip tightened around the gun, then relaxed as all the tension went to one little finger. Click. Bang. On average, a bullet from a 1911 pistol moved 830 feet in a second. An unmodified, street-legal 1911 could cover the 20 feet between them in 0.024 seconds. Not a tenth of a second, barely a quarter of a tenth of a second. A modified 1911 like Cupid had never been tested, but easily surpassed that. Another thing Ronin had never bothered to test, but the muzzle velocity alone was a drastic improvement. Enough power to blow apart Nomus, easily in the 3,000 range at least. 4,000, maybe even a low 5,000 feet per second. That put Ronin's bullet time at about 0.004 seconds. 0.004 seconds. Now, that was pretty fast. You could count on one hand the number of heroes who could react to something like that. Under a hundredth of a second to react to a tiny shard of metal, fired with so much power it was practically molten. Most heroes couldn't even outpace a normal bullet, let alone this monster of a shot. Kamui Woods, Crust, Ingenium, Maruko it was unlikely even All Might would be able to react in time. He might just be able to tank the bullet, but to react. To try and dodge that. It was absurd. The showman dug his heels into the ground, smiling as he watched Ronin pull the trigger, then swung. The roar of the gun was loud, so powerful it threatened to burst eardrums. The sound as the showman stepped forward with his blade and struck the bullet out of the air was horrendous, a crash that seemed to break all of reality. The glass tinkled daintily as it fell. Shards of glass fell from warehouse-sized windows, shattering against the ground like droplets of water. Izuku stared forward, his head overcome with a piercing ring in spite of his ear protection. Slowly he turned, his gun shaking as he peered back at the wall behind him. In the one solid wall behind him a hole sprouted, the size of a man's torso carved straight though metal and stone. Sunlight and bits of rubble trickled through the hole, the sunlight glowing gold on the dust against the dark of the warehouse. Izuku turned forward again to see him. He stood his ground, the concrete beneath him cracked slightly from the force he put out. He held his cane with two hands high in the air, like a batter after a home run hit, staring out at the hole he just made before dropping back to his casual stance. There was no guard, he put up no defense, he wore no armor, and he was still smiling. Why didn't he need defense? Why didn't he need armor? Why could he smile like that at all times? The showman worked his shoulder in small circles, shuffling forward before grabbing his cane by crook and slamming it into the ground. The showman could because he was just that damn good. They stared into each other's eyes, feeling a strange energy between them. He'd just deflected a bullet like it was nothing. Izuku should have been so scared he could barely move, but against the image of All for One, a man so strong he didn't even need to deflect bullets. The showman and the Ronin stared into each other, smiling as the energy and excitement rose between them. At that moment, Izuku could feel it. The Ronin could feel it. The energy, the excitement, the hype of fighting a strong opponent. The showman spoke, his confidence infectious as he splayed his arms out, gesturing to the scene around them as they both sauntered forward towards each other. No guards as the showman spun his cane on his finger, no hesitation as the Ronin holstered Cupid and grabbed Muramasa's saya, both ready to explode. Welcome to the big leagues. Chapter End Notes. You didn't think the guy the Discord made would be this much of a menace, did ya? Chapter 204, Showstopper. Chapter Summary. A good show knows when to see itself off. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. A glint in their eyes. The showman's jubilance as he offered his arms about the room, excitement shining through the blank face of a mask. The Ronin's determined but strange smile, flicking in and out of view as the cloth mask blew in the new cross breeze of the warehouse. A small moment as the two opponents faced each other down, a moment each man couldn't even see in the other, but they could feel it right before they crashed back into each other once again. The fight was much faster as Ronin ramped straight into his more powerful moves, switching kindness from Muramasa and lunging forward for a drawing slash, firing the gun sheath for an explosive opening attack. The showman moved into and under Ronin's drawing slash, slipping underneath the cut for his own attack but switching to a block as Ronin's leg snapped up, striking at the showman's body. His first attack missing, Ronin brought his leg up to kick the showman then brought his sword back around for another slash. Again the showman slid out of the way, lining up his own attack only to block Ronin's sudden elbow. Ronin broke his own attacks early, losing a lot of power just for the chance to attack more and more. Against a man who could deflect bullets, Ronin probably could imagine power, so he'd have to rely on what he did have and use pure speed. After two swings the showman gave up on dodging and parried Ronin's next swing, knocking it aside and then ricocheting the cane past Ronin's guard to strike him in the chest. Ronin tried to pull his sword up to try and defend, but the showman could dance around his guard like a professional. Ronin raised his sword, trying to block the next attack to his body as the showman stepped in but the showman just went lower and caught Ronin's leg with the crook of his cane, pulling Ronin off his feet with a sharp pull then stepping in to finish off the fallen vigilante. Ronin fell back with one leg raised, his guard disrupted as his opponent closed in. Could he block in time? Who needed to block? Ronin leaned into the fall, catching himself with his arms and backflipping out of the showman's way before crashing back in with two slashes. The showman's cane came down on hard concrete, then two sword slashes came in over top. The showman raised his cane as he backed off, blocking the second, but the first had been too fast and struck his arm. The showman hardly paid the slash any mind, gritting through it to deflect the second attack while still building distance and Ronin did the same, both stepping back to check how they were faring. Ronin's head was rushing, the sudden flip still disorientating him a little. Sudden spins wasn't something the young vigilante was used to, and while he pulled it off this time, he'd need a little practice before he tried to do that one intentionally again. Still, he had scored a hit. The showman was moving his arm slightly, checking it out but still seeming unperturbed. His white coat was still white so he wasn't bleeding, but his sword to the arm was still a metal stick slamming into your flesh. It hurt, and after all his years getting the tar beaten out of him, Ronin was a first-hand expert on that. They each moved in a small circle, Ronin still pressed further back towards the shelves with the showman standing in the broken glass of the skylight. Their weapons raised, Muramasa's tip a few inches from the canes. The showman pressed forward, one-handing his cane as he knocked Ronin's blade downward before thrusting in. Ronin let his sword be knocked aside as he stepped to the side with it, reaching out to the shelf behind him to grab one of the many packages and throwing it at the showman before the cane struck him in the shoulder. As cane met shoulder, the drug package flew toward the showman's face. The showman was barely inconvenienced, easily batting it aside with his other arm, but it did take him by surprise and give Ronin a chance to get fancy. Ronin grabbed another cardboard box filled with illegal cigarettes and charged the showman, slamming Muramasa against the showman's cane and skirting his blade along it to keep it out of the way as he closed in. The showman tugged, moving back and trying to pull the sword up, but he lacked the power or speed to avoid Ronin's rush. Ronin stepped into his space, smashing the new box into the showman's face before bringing his sword up for a more powerful blow. The showman couldn't see, but he still knew what to do even without sight. Muramasa stopped suppressing the showman's cane and it immediately cut through the air to strike whatever was dumb enough to sit in front of him. Ronin brought his sword up, trying to hit the showman but instead blocking a sudden sharp cut from the showman's cane. Ronin was pushed off balance by the sudden motion, stepping back half a step before the showman's cane danced off Muramasa and began to weave its way toward him again. Ronin walked himself back as the showman pushed forward, regaining sight and regaining control over the fight with a few flicks of the wrist. The showman's cane created sparks as it slid nimbly along Muramasa, batting it this way and that before weaving in small piercing strikes against Ronin, a sudden cut to the arm or a swift stab against his torso. It was obvious who was the better swordsman. Even without an edge, the showman's every cut and thrust sent pain through Ronin's bodysuit and straight into his body, doing more damage with what seemed blocked attacks than the Yakuza had done with their hits. In sheer skill, Ronin was as outclassed by the showman as the Yakuza had been by him. His sword couldn't even attack against the showman's pressure, instead relying on defense to try and avoid or at least lessen the brunt of the showman's sharp skills. But then again, there was a hell of a lot more to a fight than just skill. Ronin let himself be pushed back, using the bodysuit-enhanced speed to retreat quickly and suddenly before jumping back and up onto the shelves. The showman took a parting shot at Ronin's form, clipping his leg on the way back, but Ronin managed to stay steady enough to grip the shelf support beams and climb on, taking a stance atop the shelving unit overlooking the showman. Having fun, are we, monkey? The showman didn't seem perturbed in the slightest, flicking his arm for his cards once again before sending a few metal razors Ronin's way. Damn straight. Ronin had a strange smile on his face as he crouched atop the shelving unit looking down, barely noticing the metal playing cards as they spun towards him and pierced his coat with a quiet thunk. He ignored them, rising to the ceiling to grip the rafters before giving the shelving unit a sharp kick in the showman's direction. Quote. Well shit, the showman didn't wait to finish his cursing as the shelving unit swayed once on its supports before tipping forward, scores of packaging suddenly falling towards the villain backed by the weight of an entire metal shelf. He didn't stick around to see if he could deflect that with his cane, rushing to one side and diving out of the way. Ronin knew he could climb a wall with Beowulf, but he still hadn't the chance to fully test its limits. Now seemed as good a time as ever though as Ronin pulled himself to the ceiling with his one arm, planting his feet and activating the boots before rising to a stand on the ceiling like a bat. The showman barely got a second to roll to his feet before he was diving again as Ronin stuck Muramasa through the ceiling and drew Cupid again, taking beat and firing immediately. Damn. The showman rolled behind another shelving unit for cover as packages were blasted off, raining down onto the ground as the entire shelf unit rocked from the force. The showman glanced back up at Ronin, hurling a single metal card before it got shot out of the air. God damn. Ronin tried to move, but the moment he tried to lift one of Beowulf's boots he could tell that he wouldn't be staying on the ceiling much longer if he did. He then holstered Cupid and ripped Muramasa out of the metal roof, creating a small shower of sparks as he kicked off the ceiling and fell with confidence onto the shelving unit the showman hid behind. Ronin flipped midair and landed on the shelving unit feet first, toppling it over and riding it down while batting the falling packages aside before jumping off the shelf just before it crashed. The showman danced away again, dashing out from the newest falling shelf and knocking aside the odd falling box with relative ease before an entire person came crashing into him. Ronin leapt off the shelf mid-fall and straight into the showman, cane clashing with sword in another display of sparks as the showman was pushed along by the sheer force of Ronin's dive attack. The showman slid across broken glass and concrete, his cane and Muramasa coming closer and closer as Ronin pressed down almost on top of him before a flick of the wrist let Ronin's sudden weight slide along the cane and right past the showman, the two parting with a sharp strike to Ronin's ribs before they both regained their footing and faced each other down. The showman kept one arm forward, the other resting comfortably on his hip like a model walking down the runway. Nice hops for a monkey, sa tilde mu tilde rai. Anything else? Ronin gripped his ribs, feeling the pain of all the attacks starting to get through him but keeping his sword raised defensively with the other arm, trying to ward off his opponent from any sudden moves. I got plenty of tricks, showman. Ronin and the showman both stepped in on the attack, swinging their swords with one hand, but the showman's was a cane designed for it while Muramasa was a big fuck-off sword. The showman's smaller weapon easily outpaced Muramasa despite the difference in the two fighters' speed, bypassing the katana to instead jab once again at Ronin's ribs and instead finding purchase on Ronin's other arm. Ronin activated Beowulf, grabbing the showman's cane before it could flee and getting a good grip on it while his own attack slammed into the showman's side, slashing across the showman's arm again. Shit. The showman reacted immediately, tensing up as the serrated sword pulled free of his arm, but there was still no blood. The showman definitely had some armor under that stupid white coat, proving that he was more of a villain than he looked, but the cuts were still having an effect as the villain let his pain show through and tried to wrestle his cane free of Ronin's grasp. Ronin yanked the cane about, trying to pull it out of the way so he could attack cleanly again but the showman was content to ride along. Now that he could see it coming, the showman moved with his cane, hopping along the ground quickly and yanking it around himself to keep the cane between himself and Ronin's sharp sword. Ronin pulled and pushed, trying to lead the fight, but the showman was content to follow that lead and ghost him, turning with his opponent to stay clear of that big sword Ronin was trying to use one-handed. Muramasa wasn't meant to be a one-handed sword and Ronin's swordsmanship was suffering for it. Even with a firm grip on the showman's cane, he couldn't manage to land a hit on the slippery bastard. Ronin ended the standoff by shoving the cane straight into the showman and letting go then jumping right at his opponent, forcing the showman to stop reacting and make his own decision to ward off the next attack. The showman stumbled back, no longer able to rely on his opponent for support, but quickly recovered with a small spin before coming back in with an attack of his own. The showman leaned to the side, getting an arm underneath him and putting all his weight on it to jump off the ground and kick Ronin with both feet in the chest, then flipping off his opponent to land on his feet. Ronin might have been impressed with the audacity of this bitch if he wasn't suddenly launched backward, hitting and then tripping over the shelving units that he himself had knocked over. It was amazing in hindsight how no matter what they did, the showman looked cool while he looked like an idiot. At least he was consistent. The showman had a quick laugh at him as he approached, strutting over while Ronin rolled off the shelving unit onto solid ground, then hit the shelving unit with a heavy kick to launch it right as the showman tried to walk on it. The showman swayed, doing his best to keep his balance on the slim surface of the shelves, but with Ronin running interference and tackling him he stood no chance. Ronin body checked the swaying showman while he was off balance, giving the villain no time for tricks and launching him back across the warehouse. The showman stumbled across shattered glass, regaining footing while Ronin continued to slam into him. The showman slid to the side to evade Ronin's next tackle, but with Beowulf's pull quirk in the showman's own stupid-looking coat he couldn't get far, yanked around by his own fashion back into Ronin's rampage. Ronin didn't even use his sword, relying on the bodysuit's durability and his own strength as he slammed the showman back over and over. He brought punches, elbows, and knee strikes against the showman to rapidly force the villain back until he brought him all the way against a still-standing shelf unit on the far side from where they started. The showman backed into the shelving unit, trying to take a step further to his own surprise and only sparing a glance back before Ronin stepped in for his next attack. The showman grabbed Ronin by the head and spun, gripping him by the back of the head while Ronin grabbed the showman, latching onto the side of his face before both slammed the other's face into the shelf. Bam. Fuck. Sheet. Both combatants immediately pulled back, both grabbing their heads as they fumbled for their weapons. The showman swung his cane wildly, going straight over Ronin's head to hit the shelving unit again and sent a jolt down his arm while he continued to back up, swaying his cane at everything and anything to try and defend himself. Fuck. Fuck. Gah. Fuck. Ronin did a little better, more used to head injuries with his constant reliance on headbutts, but the head slam had left his eyes watering and something warm running down his face. Ronin lurched back while sticking close to the shelf, not even noticing the showman's own terrible swinging while he tried to get himself under control. You little. Both attempted a wild swing, finally finding connection as Muramasa met the cane, but Ronin finally won in exchange with his better power and speed by batting the showman's cane aside and throwing the showman back further. Not that he could see it, with his eyes still fucked up, but a victory was a victory however minor. Who really came to first hardly mattered, but the first one to do something was Ronin. Ronin shook his head and pushed off the shelf, backing away and building distance while rummaging through his coat. He still kept Muramasa up to attempt to guard, pointing the jagged tip towards the showman as he retreated. The showman's sporadic swinging died down as the showman regained control over himself and his surroundings, changing his death grip on his cane to a more relaxed hold while he brought the tip back up like a fencer. Man, I can't believe we're both dirty cheaters. Isn't one of us supposed to play fair? Do you think I'm stupid enough to fight fair? Ronin rummaged through his coat, refocusing through the pain. Fighting fair. No way, no how, no can do. Ronin had never been under the false impression that he was good, but he had enough common sense and experience to see when someone was better than him. Quote. Well, I could hope you are. The showman worked his neck, then spat some blood out to the side, the blood passing straight through his mask as if it wasn't there. Was it some kind of hologram? Who would waste a hologram on being a mask? It couldn't even protect your face. Shit. Ronin weaved back as the showman sprung forward, putting his whole body behind a piercing lunge. Ronin only managed to avoid it by springing backward and striking the cane to one side with Muramasa, using his entire body to defend while still retreating. The showman had a quick laugh as he sped up, keeping close to Ronin while continuing to thrust. While Ronin made large slashing motions to try and block the showman's thrusts, the showman just pulled his cane back before thrusting it out again. Ronin struggled to keep pace, which was strange. He definitely should have been faster, his suit should have made sure of it. While the showman seemed fast enough to block bullets with his weapon, he clearly wasn't using that speed now, so how was he keeping up with the muscle suit? Better question, how was he faster than it? Ronin struggled to use Muramasa with just one hand, especially pitted against the showman's superior swordsmanship. He'd been struggling two-handed, and that was his preferred fighting style. Trying to copy the art. The showman was aware of it too, picking up quickly on the change on pushing it to his advantage. To think I'd have a copycat so soon. Who's copying who? Ronin shouted indignantly, but the comparisons were inevitable. If there was a villain who fought this similarly to himself, it was a wonder the Hero Association didn't think they were the same person. Hell, even he had his doubts, and he was seeing this copycat in the flesh. Ronin pulled something from his coat as he deflected another thrust and lobbed it at the showman, but the showman would have none of it. The showman's cane flicked up, adjusting mid-attack to casually bat the projectile aside, knocked between the shelving units. He didn't need to draw a ranged weapon himself, but could, and so he did. Another metal card appeared in the showman's hand and shot forward in just 2 flicks, again embedding itself in Ronin's coat. Ronin tried to bat the card aside as the showman had, but he didn't have the skill. Instead, his swing went wide, soaring past the thin weapon and leaving a clear path in for the showman as he swung. The showman moved in as soon as Ronin took the bait, flipping his cane around to hold the end. He crouched as he moved in, drawing his body in close to the ground and cane sliding along the ground to hook around Ronin's leg. One sharp pull from the showman brought Ronin's leg up, and that one leg brought the rest of Ronin down. His legs separated and unbalanced, Ronin could only tumble backward to land roughly on his back. The showman stepped in, bringing his cane along the ground to crash into the fallen vigilante. Muramasa was much harder to use on the ground, barely able to sneak between Ronin's body and the showman's cane to intercept the attack. Ronin still used it with one hand as he rolled to his feet, trying to mimic the showman's moves by sweeping the legs, but it was for naught. Ronin spun on his free arm to his feet, bringing his sword around as he spun to cut into his foe's ankles, but the showman jumped over the swing easily before spiking a leg up to kick Ronin one more time in the chest. Crack tilde. Ronin lurched backward, only partially from the force of the kick as he clutched his ribs. His breathing became ragged suddenly as his body exploded in pain, letting him know again just how much wide the gap between them was. He kept his sword up through gritted teeth, still clutching his ribs with one hand while the showman watched. Slowly he put his feet back under himself, letting out heavy breaths tinged with a spittle of blood, eyes locked on his opponent. Oh, I'm sorry. The showman watched his entertainment with what seemed amused eyes, still spinning that cane on a finger as he kept his distance. Did that hurt tilde? Ronin drew from the coat again, lurching back as he threw the new object at the showman. The showman didn't even try to deflect it as it went wide, hitting a package on a shelf beside his head with a pitiful ting tilde. He even turned to look at it a second, taking his eyes off the vigilante to inspect the miss himself before shooting the retreating vigilante a bemused smile beneath his mask. Now what was the bang pine tilde? Fuck. Luckily, flashbangs didn't care who was better than who. There was some comfort in their consistency, like the piercing ring that Doug echoed across warehouse I starting atop a shelf right next to the showman's head. Ronin managed to keep both his legs under himself as he retreated, keeping an eye on his opponent while he stumbled away. While his cloth mask hadn't blocked much of the flashbang, his earplugs and repetition did a great job of keeping him ready for this moment as he made his great escape. Ronin wasn't here to beat villains after all, Ronin was here for the drugs littered about the warehouse. He was trying to create a scene that the police couldn't overlook, and to do that, he'd brought a little something he stole from the Yakuza a long time ago. Ronin's feet found strength as he reached into his coat, still shielding his ribs while he fumbled around before pulling out a small remote. Flashbangs weren't the only things he threw around in that warehouse. Damn, goddamn, the showman shouted, still holding an ear as he began to find his footing. Already he glanced up, his mask seeming to flicker for a moment to show his wide smile as he got his bearings. Even with his ears damaged and his balance disturbed, the showman's quick recovery was more than Ronin could deal with. What a rush. But how would the showman deal with Ronin's distraction? Ronin finally found the remote buried in his coat's pocket and hit the switch, then threw himself towards the door as the explosives went off. Bang. The bomb was a small explosive stolen forever ago from the Yakuza. Midoriya had picked it up more on a whim than anything else, having found the remote first from some Yakuza who tried to threaten him with it. Nearly shit himself afterwards when it turned out the guy wasn't bluffing, but that guy had forgotten to activate the detonator so it all barely worked out. The bomb was the first projectile Midoriya had thrown just before the flashbang, not beside into the mess of shelving units, but even in that position it exploded well enough. The bomb wasn't very flashy, barely audible against the flashbang before a sweeping wave of dust flew out from behind the shelves and across the room. But even if it looked small, that shockwave sent the shelves tumbling down as the whole building shook, a heavy gust blowing through the building and rattling everything as the debris was flung to every corner of the warehouse. The pressure knocked Midoriya back on his ass, tossing him beside the door with ears ringing once again as the world swam. The showman didn't seem to react at all, eyes focused on Ronin 1 second and gone the next amidst a cloud of dust and drugs. This shit probably wasn't that good to breathe in. Midoriya held his cloth mask over his face to try and protect himself while he stumbled into the front door, throwing the lock off quickly before stumbling outside. The sunlight almost seemed to punch him in the face, another quick shift to hurt his eyes before he got used to the glare. Midoriya shielded his eyes with Muramasa and an arm, then glanced back and decided to keep running before calling it quits. Releasing his mask, Midoriya tossed one of his last smoke grenades outside the warehouse before he booked it. It wasn't much, but after you knocked yourself on your ass with an explosion you only tested once at a firing range, you took what you could get. Midoriya made it a few buildings over before turning back to good old warehouse I, leaning against a building both to catch his breath and hide while taking in his work. Something had obviously gone down in there. For one, there was the hole in the wall the showman had made. 2, almost all the windows were shattered leaving bits of broken glass all around the place. Third, and most obviously, a large purple cloud rose from warehouse I leaking through the holes and shattered windows. Probably the toxin lover's drugs that had been caught in the blast. Hopefully, the police would see it and investigate the place, but maybe only after the cloud died down. Midoriya still wasn't sure what the drug actually did, maybe Mao would know, but there were better times to find out than now. Right now Ronin wasn't just looking for buildings though, he was looking for people. A full minute of waiting and there was no sign of the showman. Not through the shutter door, the front door, or the side door Midoriya left through. Nothing. Midoriya cast his eyes around the warehouse, but short of the showman jumping out a window, it didn't look like he was coming out of warehouse I. Not that there was a chance he died. The explosion Midoriya had used was designed to break walls, or at least, that's what he thought it did. It wasn't really clear what it did when he and Mao tested one in the army bunker, but it didn't really seem like the type of bomb meant for turning people into giblets. The showman had been more inconvenienced by the sudden noise of the flashbang than he had a bullet flying towards his head, and that kind of shot would take out some tough heroes like Maruko or Ingenium. An explosion on a far wall stood no chance of taking him out. But still, Midoriya couldn't see him. Maybe there was some back way out, maybe the drugs that got caught up in the explosion were doing something, but for one reason or another, the showman wasn't coming out. Wee woo. Wee woo. Wee woo. What Midoriya could hear though was the sound of sirens, police sirens. Still coming, but it wasn't good to keep them waiting. The police usually took around 10 minutes to get this far from the station, so they were a little early, but that was more Midoriya running behind. The showman had put a bigger hold on his plans than he thought. Midoriya had wasted enough time. Pushing off the wall, the young vigilante ran through the warehouses, streets and alleys, using his mental map to take a few quick shortcuts to make it to the escape route as fast as he could. In one such alley by a few dumpsters, the hum of an engine broke the distant blaring of the sirens. A motorcycle once hidden now pulled out, already started and ready to go. Sitting atop his motorcycle, Mao smiled confidently at Midoriya with his mask pulled up off his face, arms crossed as he leaned back on his ride. The cheekiness in his expression did not go unnoticed. Baba backquote bitch boy. Dumbass. They quickly nodded to each other as Midoriya approached, taking Muramasa off his belt and catching the duffel bag Mao threw at him. Midoriya shoved all his spare things into the bag as he moved up to the motorcycle, then took Mao's graciously offered hand up onto the giant thing. Dad excitement you. Mao was looking upward to the sky, eyes focused on the still rising purple cloud gently drifting in the breeze. A clear indication that something shady was going on inside the warehouses like Midoriya wanted, but a little more dangerous than he would have liked. Ran into a villain, showman. Had to use the bomb, but it was a little improvised. Midoriya settled in his spot behind Mao on the motorcycle, making sure anything extra was put away before they blasted off. Didn't want to drop the duffel bag on the way out. Any problems? 30 guys, a dozen guns, no biggie. Mao shrugged it off, leaning forward to rev the engine while glancing back as a pre-flight check. Dem police ain't there yet, but any chance of arrows? Let's hope not. Mask. Midoriya flicked Mao's mask down for him, then got a good grip on the big guy's bandages. Sure, Mao had a fake face right now with his weird shapeshifting quirk, but better to remain anonymous than give the police even a chance of catching up. Hope not, he says. Mao got a chuckle out of that, but still he adjusted his mask and reeved the engine once more before they peeled out. But with your luck. Quote. Fuck. Chapter end notes. Yo, a quick end to a quick villain that I had a lot of fun with. The showman was a character I've had in mind for a long time, but was finally given name by the Discord. I've often been asked while writing Ronin why Midoriya is so good with a sword. A great question. The man's only been using a sword for a year, and a proper sword for even less. He's got no formal training, just a few drills he picked up in the practice he gets while beating the shit out of criminals who weren't ready for a sword fight. So how is he so good with a sword? Simple. He isn't. Ronin has never won a sword fight with anyone who has so much as an ounce of proper training. He lost to Stain once, tied to Stain in their second fight even with weapon superiority, plus he had to resort to a 2v1 to win, and has yet to even seriously hurt Mao without cheating. The showman, thus, is created to be the nail in the coffin. Ronin is an alright sword fighter. He knows where his sword goes and how to swing it. He slashes with his sword, he jabs with his hands, and he kicks with his legs. The showman is a swordsman. He knows how to hit with sword and how to use it. He cuts with a blunt cane, thrusts with a dull tip, and strikes with whatever he pleases. Ronin isn't a great swordsman, but he usually doesn't need to be. He fights criminals with knives, quirks, and massive egos regularly while sporting some of the best body armor of any hero or villain, namely, any, since most people don't even bother with armor. Hell, the showman's metal cards couldn't even pierce the bodysuit, but since he didn't know that, he kept wasting time throwing them. This was a fun fight for me since I got to show off what Ronin has yet to learn, a real understanding of swordsmanship beyond the basics, while showing what Ronin has down pat, cheating in a fight and using irregular tactics. The next raid arc definitely won't be this long, probably just a few paragraphs to sum up the action, but it was fun to show the stuff Midoriya does during these raids and some of the shenanigans he pulls to get himself out of the messes he makes. But before then, we've got some schoolwork to do, we've got some kendo clubs to learn from, and most of all, we've got all of Ronin's shit to sort through and finally get around to testing. Seriously, how much shit has that twerp stolen from the Yakuza and police over the years, and just how many flashbangs does he really have? Join us next time on Shaggy Ball Z to find out. Adios amigos, and thanks for reading. Chapter 205, Respite. Chapter Summary. Some calm after a lot of action. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. The streets were never truly quiet, the echoes of police sirens ringing out across the warehouse's vast emptiness. Birds fluttered overhead as the sun began to dip behind the city's distant skyscrapers, their wings flapping in time to the revving of a motorcycle engine. All alone in the warehouse, Mao and Midoriya raced around warehouse corners fast and straightaways even faster, the main man never letting up on the gas pedal as they got closer to the warehouse's outer wall. So dem arrows, they take a while to get around. Mao was still smiling big underneath the Yakuza hunter's mask, leaning back as he handled his chopper with practiced ease. The bumps of the road as he took shortcuts barely seemed to faze him as he kept his eyes trained on their exit path, always looking for the next corner to take until they were finally out. And no cars, remember. This isn't America, they usually have to use public transport or something. Midoriya clung to Mao's back not out of fear, but in a genuine effort to not be dislodged. Mao's shortcuts of jumping walkways and grabbing light posts to make sudden turns were doing more damage to the smaller boy than the Yakuza's attacks. So that's why super speed's so good in this place. Mao took in Midoriya's words with a nod, thinking it over, then laughing as he leaned over and grabbed the road, his fingers carving through the asphalt as the bike made a hard turn before uprighting itself. With that final bone-shuddering turn, the duo made it to the back gate. Mao finally slowed the exhausting ride as Midoriya fell off the bike, landing on his feet with a small stumble before moving to the gate controls. Drawing a gate card from one of his many coat pockets, Midoriya opened the gate. The card had been just one of the things he got to prepare for today, along with a small storage area paid for in cash by Ken. Too bad it would probably be deactivated once the warehouse company checked their records and saw who blew up one of their warehouses. Still say we could have hop the fence, Mao bemused from atop his motorcycle, leaning over the handlebars board as Midoriya climbed back on. Ramped off a something got some air, woulda looked pretty badass. Ramped off of what? Your ego. Midoriya adjusted his position before they rolled through the gate, quickly picking up speed again and turning away from the sirens. We would have to have a ramp set up inside the gate to get back out. Details, schmitails. Mao laughed as he drove faster and faster, slowly outpacing the sirens but picking up steam. Zhu stuff to set up for done next time we do this. They didn't even see a police car as they careened their way out of the city, let alone any resistance on their way back to Mao's military base. After parking inside, they took the chance to go over the small details of their raid, including looking over drugs Midoriya had found inside Lucky Little Warehouse I. Showman. They both sat in the ammunition room, but while Midoriya analyzed the drugs, Mao sat on a counter cleaning his piece while he thought over Midoriya's fight. Midoriya had given him a brief rundown on the way over, talking so he had something to pay attention to other than Mao's reckless road rampage, but now that they were sitting around, the main man could really think and analyze Midoriya's story, using his expertise and years in the crime world to give his input. Quote. Yup, never heard of him. Who he was exactly barely matters, but the fact that the Shu Isekai has somebody like him makes me worried. Midoriya wasn't some forensics expert, but he did have some drugs from the old toxin lovers, stuff made back in the day. He could at least compare those two and try to find something. If the Shu Isekai has guys like that just sitting around in their warehouses, I'm worried about their upper ranks. Those guys could be a serious threat. PSSHT. The Shi Hassaikai ain't no big deal. Mao waved them off dismissively, then picked up a small bristle to clean the gun's barrel. The OL boss ran some numbers on all the big players ever year back in da day, and while your little Shu Isekai got some power players, 90%'s a joke. Maybe even 95. Don't suppose you remember who those big names were, do you? Midoriya spared Mao a glance, eager to look at something other than a pair of purple cigarettes. Mao barely even needed a moment, closing his eyes in concentration before counting them off on his fingers. Drunken Master, Great Wall, Rappa, Devourer, Simulant, Sly Hands, Eternal Rage, and some wimp I never gave a sheep out. Midoriya blinked at Mao, muttering some of the names to himself. Drunken Master, Great Wall, Rappa, what kind of names are those? Actual I think Rappa's his real name. Oh. The Hero Association comes up with the names usually, less ya announce it yourself, Mao reminded Midoriya with a shrug before putting the bristle down and checking his work with a small flashlight. I was called Juggernaut back in da States, but that one was pretty good so I kept it for a while. This seems unprofessional. Midoriya mused over the villains' names he knew. Toxic Chainsaw, All for One, Kurogiri, which was just the Japanese for Black and Fog mashed together, which means the Hero Association definitely did it. You're lucky Sendipider, usually vigilantes get stuck with a really stupid name. Mao pointed the flashlight towards Midoriya as he spoke, shining it right in the kid's eye before he flicked it off. How did you come up with Ronin anyway? Midoriya took only a second to think about it before he pushed all memories of that back down in his mind and instead held up the cigarettes he'd been looking at. Not important. What is still important is that these drugs look pretty much identical, which means they should be the same stuff toxin lovers made back when they were around. Mao looked over the two cigarettes, which true to form did look identical in that they looked equally generic save for the purple in place of orange markings on them. Quote. And that means something . Quote dot dot dot. Kind of. Midoriya glanced down at the cigarettes, shrugging. He wasn't exactly an entire crime lab, he couldn't be sure, but he could make estimates and work with those. If these are the same product, they might be produced in the same place, so I can go stir up some of Toxin Lover's old turf and find the production lab. More places to go, people ta beat da sheet outa, I like it. Mao gave a complimentary thumbs up, smiling, then turned back to his current work. I don't backquote suppose you already backquote got some of those places, do ya? No, but Toxin Lovers was way less discreet the Shu Isekai. Just a little poking around on the web and I can get their old hideouts, compare that with the stuff I know about the Yakuza. Midoriya began to speak faster and faster, losing Mao when he got to the part about comparing the distance between these Shu Isekai people and the old Toxic Lobsters people that Mao used to work with. Mao just nodded along, pretending he got it. With careful planning and a little digging, we should be able to find at least one of the labs. Got it. Mao continued nodding, trying to put together all the words Midoriya said, but some of that Japanese came out so fast it just sounded like gibberish. Basically, in English. My English isn't that good. Mao blinked, thinked over the phrase, then rephrased. In simple stuff, you gonna go check some sheet, then we might have some places to raid. Yeah, basically, Midoriya confirmed it with a shrug, already beginning to write in one of his notebooks. It might take a bit, but it's gonna be way faster than finding those warehouses was. Good. Mao worked a little faster, the excitement fresh in his mind while Midoriya finished his notes, only pausing as a stray thought entered his mind. Quote dot dot dot. Hey, Mao, you picked your name when you came to Japan, right? Yup. Still wanted in like 7 countries. At least. The memories made the big guy laugh, putting away his bristle and flashlight into a small repair kit to then take out a small stopper of oil. Good times. Why? Why'd you pick Voorhees as your last name? Midoriya squinted, noticing the small twitch in Mao's face. It might have only been for a moment, but he flinched. This motherfucker flinched. Hey, Mao. Midoriya's smile stopped reaching his eyes as he stared at this dumbass, the story slowly forming in his. The young lady took in the scenery on her way in, taking a little extra time to admire the artwork on the side of the buildings. Colorful paintings of abstract images, words and something beyond bold lettering, strange mixes of English and Japanese painted together, and that graffiti looked new. Eiko took it in for a little longer before moving on, turning back to the way forward and almost jumping at the sight of another surprise. Glancing around to make sure nobody saw her, Eiko began to move forward as inconspicuously as possible. She ducked into alleys and hid behind ledges, keeping an eye on her target while slowly gaining on him. Then, right before they reached the school, Eiko sprung for her hiding spot and towered over him, reaching out. Eiko reached out from behind Midoriya, hesitating as she thought over if she really wanted to scare someone, then settled for gently tapping his shoulder. Midoriya glanced over his shoulder, his surprise evident on his face as he glanced back then up at her. Oh, hey Eiko. Hey, Eiko's smile grew, her sneak a total success. While scaring people wasn't her thing, his surprised face really was worth all the effort of stealthing it up. She had a quick quiet chuckle to herself as she moved next to her friend, falling in step with Midoriya as they both moved toward the gate, Midoriya moving with a bit more weight in his step despite his small size. Eiko. Midoriya glanced up at her, clearly thinking over his words and settling for placing a gentle but firm hand on her arm, being too short to reach her shoulder without stretching. I'm so sorry. For what? Eiko tilted her head, trying to figure out what Midoriya was talking about, but nothing came to mind. They had just met this morning and hadn't seen each other since school yesterday, and she couldn't recall anything happening between now and then. Unless he was the one who had eaten all of her favorite cereal. No, wait, that was Dad. Oh, nothing important. Midoriya just smiled softly and faced forward, the pair coming up on the school's main gate. He adjusted his bag, tapping a wooden pole that stuck out of it. I'm here early for kendo. You. Studying. Eiko patted her own duffel bag, packed with all the books and notes she bought at the beginning of the school year. I fell behind when homeroom sensei started teaching yesterday, but it won't happen again. Eiko clenched her first, determined to meet her goal while Midoriya chuckled to himself, passing through the school's front gate and turning to each other before parting. You need any help with those studies, you know where I'll be for lunch. Yeah, Eiko nodded, glad to have her friend's support, and gave him a thumbs up in response. Good luck with your kendo stuff. I don't really know much about kendo, but I'm sure you've got this. Midoriya smirked at her words, waving goodbye one last time before both moved through their respective doorways into their own separate worlds. Chapter and notes. You, a rational human, Bo, you can't have a chapter that's nothing but stupid jokes. I thought we were gonna take stock of all the random stuff that Midoriya has in his arsenal and finally get around to testing what the possessed items can do. Me, with Dr. Pepper and a song in my heart, just how many jokes can I cram in a single chapter? Bonjour amigos. I don't have much to say other than damn, I've been sitting on some of these jokes for a while and I'm glad I finally get to use them. They might not be amazing, but I've had fun with them. Especially with the jokes that they've set up in the future. I'm trying to repeat stuff less, but this is calm chapter after the action spree of the Yakuza raid. I wanted it to be pretty light since we're going straight back into the action with the Kendo Club and Midoriya testing his stuff, which will get pretty packed on the action. Gotta plan your breaks and breaths in advance so that the action doesn't get monotonous. That's about it. A short chapter that could have come out earlier, but my editor has a life and this thing needed a lot of fixing before it was released. Shout out again to Ebony Bird of Doom, and shout out to y'all for reading this far. Till next time, adios amigos. Chapter 206, Dummies Dueling. Chapter Summary. Midoriya uses the Kendo Club for the original reason he joined it, to practice fighting and hopefully pick up a few sword skills along the way. Chapter Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Midoriya gave Eiko a small wave as they parted, a final glance to his quiet friend before he turned back to the messy hall of hell that was the Kendo Club, the old Ishiyama gymnasium. He touched his ribs, feeling the dull ache as he breathed, then returned to the moment in those doors. He'd come to this club to improve his swordsmanship, and now that he was more motivated than ever. One heavy sigh more to hurt his ribs again and Midoriya pushed open the Kendo Club's sliding door, walking in with a confidence unbefitting his usual meek persona. The Kendo Club was cleaner than usual, mostly because the club hadn't even had a whole day to be there. With a police investigation just one day ago, the club had been vacated as its members pretended to be good little boys and girls and stay in the real classrooms. Was probably the first time most of them even went to their real classes. The club members had returned to form, though. Across its halls the members were spread, sitting and standing in their various cliques and subcliques. Some sat by that stupid TV, radiating garbage, while others stood to the side, vaping and smoking with a few in the back seeming fast asleep. Midoriya moved past all of these, eyes locked on the prize. In the middle of the room there were actually a few people fighting. Not kendo fighting, of course, just plain 3-on-1. No rules, no safety, and no standards as the three punks took on the diminutive demon. Three delinquents stood side by side, armed with pipes and sticks attacking with no real sense of technique. Opposing them with seemingly even less technique stood one of the only people who Midoriya knew, Fairy. Fairy stood his ground against the three with confidence unfettered and sword flying. He used his hardwood katana with both hands, batting away their attacks and bashing through them to go directly for his opponents. There were a few people around the fight. Some watched, some cheered, and a few laid to the side, possibly having already been on the receiving end of Fairy's attacks. The most prominent figure by being the only other person whose name Midoriya could remember, albeit barely, was Kinky. The vice president or sub-leader or whatever of the kendo club, Kinky stood to one side with her own sword resting tip first on the ground, holding it in both hands while she watched the fight. She took it in from the side, looking at both sides at once with no bodies to get in her way. Her eyes were on the arms, 4 weapons darting about as Fairy pushed his way into and through the 3 guards with ease, totally unaware as the quiet criminal moved beside her. The fight was already closing when Midoriya arrived, Fairy dispatching the 3 delinquents with the same flurry of attacks that he dealt with everything. Instead of ending on the first hit, the grunts kept standing until their legs couldn't. A touch more in line with how things worked in the brawls and raids the kendo club took part in, but well past a touch more painful. The fight finished as the final man slipped, his leg giving way leading to his everything giving way from the constant crushing barrage of blows putting him off his feet and on his ass against the mat. Ha ha, now this was fun. Fairy kept his sword pointed at the final man a moment longer, eyes locked to make sure the fight was over before taking a step back and resting his hardwood against his shoulder. Not bad, you sorry lot. Not bad at all. Now get off my floor and get your asses cleaned up. The crowd came alive, a total of 4 boys speaking to Fairy briefly before heading off stiffly. Others stayed around, congratulating Fairy on another win, while Kinky hung at the back with a confident smile as she appraised her brother's work. And likewise, Midoriya stayed back and thought over the small scuffle. Fairy's sword work was in no way good. It was sloppy, putting too much weight behind everything. It lacked real focus, just attacking everything in sight, yet it had somehow beaten him. No ways good, but still good enough it seemed. Midoriya had also seen the raid the kendo club took part in against another school, some group of bandana delinquents who came to and fought the kendo club in their home turf, and how the kendo club fought. The whole club was about as bad as those 4 guys, 3 even if you count the guy who went down before Midoriya arrived, so most of the talent rested on 2. The president and vice president. His eyes flicked to her as the crowd finished parting, finding focus as he arranged his thoughts. The swordsmanship might seem sloppy, but so had his compared to the showman. That villain's level of control and grace was far beyond him, and if he wanted to practice fighting something even remotely like that. Fairy turned to his sister, sword and smirk still stuck fast to him as his eyes met hers. 4-on-1, pretty impressive, even if that first guy knocked himself out, still counts. Whatever. Kinky rolled her eyes, but she had to admit, alright, maybe it was a little impressive. Hey. Almost as impressive as how big your head can get. Kinky leaned on her sword, her posture relaxed as she took a cheap shot. And for such a little body, too. Twack. Ow. She really should have watched her mouth when Fairy's sword was right there. While his sister rubbed her head, looking a lot less graceful and a hell of a lot more grouchy, Fairy nodded towards the retreating figure of the 4. Think you could have done that? Kinky didn't respond, giving him a confusing look, so he continued. I'm not gonna be at Ishiyama forever, dingus. Someday you're gonna run this shit show, and you're gonna have to step up. Running this place ain't just about barking orders, you know. The hardwood katana flicked off his shoulder again as he pointed it high into the air, creating a slight hum as the dull edge split the air. Power. Gotta have the power to push this dump forward. Sure, knocking heads around is good, but what good's a gang that can't win? What good's a gang with no good members? Kinky huffed to herself, crossing her arms in indignation, but she knew she certainly could not take on 4 people like her older brother just did, even if one of them took himself out on accident. It just wasn't her style. Excuses. This time when Fairy whacked her, he just did it with a gentle chop to the head, ruffling her hair up more. Stop complaining and work with what you got. Their crew really didn't have any power players, but what could you do? Recruit more. Please, the only person they managed to recruit was some guy from the crafting club, and who the fuck even knew where he was right? Oh god, he was right behind them. Fairy blinked and moved half a step back as he finally noticed the green-haired kid from the crafting club standing behind them, catching himself slipping and straightening quickly. His sister took a moment longer to notice, glancing over her shoulder before turning to address him fully. There you are. We've been wondering where you got off to. The quiet freshman didn't say anything, one hand on his bag as he stared up at Kinky. Damn, his eyes were creepy. Hey, no need to be shouty. We're all here for something, so let's calm down a second. Fairy took this as a chance to show some of that leadership he was supposed to have, reining in his sister with a gentle thwap to her arm to get her attention before devoting his to the freshie. How are the swords coming? 12 more done. He kept his words brief as he shifted his weight from one foot to another, his bag swaying as the kendo sword inside stuck out, making the weight more than a little lopsided. You wanted 30. Yeah, you got a good head for numbers, kid. 12 more, Between that and the ones this kid had brought earlier, that brought them up to. Wait, how many did he bring in earlier? ... Shit, didn't matter. Got him in your club room. Yep, the little rascal gave a court nod, then glanced past them. Fairy's eyes trailed his to the dissipating crowd after the last fight. That reminded him, this punk had challenged him to a fight a while ago, before the shit with the police and the bandana Ds. He even had a pretty good defense too, for a nerd. Was he looking for another round? What, you want some action, freshie? Fairy spoke with his telltale smirk, bringing his hardwood against his shoulder and his hand on his hip. This punk wanted to join the kendo club for a bit in exchange for the swords, so was this little rascal looking for a beating or two. He'd be happy to oblige. This place'll give ya a fight anytime, anywhere y'd like. Good. There was a hint of satisfaction in his tone as he nodded, taking Fairy a bit by surprise with his sharp reply. Most people fought once against him and weren't eager for a second match, now this was gonna be fun. Alright. Fairy's smirk grew into a full smile as his grip on the hardwood tightened, taking a step towards the pretentious punk that thought he could challenge him. Man, and that kid thought he got his ass whooped last time, you wanna throw down? Kinky. The vigilant fighter turned on his heel, finally directing his attention from the club president to its vice president as he drew his own kendo stick in a single fluid motion, the tip flicking gently through the air then taking a sharp turn to point at her. I wish to fight you. Fairy hung on his last breath, his grip slowly going slack as his mouth fell open while Kinky finally looked at the freshman with half-open eyes, then looking back to her brother for just a moment before fully realizing what the little guy said and doubling back with eyes wide open. Quote. Hey. Fairy jumped a little bit with his laugh as he thought it over, slowly turning to give his sister the look over. By now there were plenty of looks cast their way by the club members, so this was really shaping up to be a fun time all around. The ball's on this kid. Hee hee. Alright, you want a crack at the VP? Fairy and Kinky shared a glance, a small shrug, then turned back to the crafting kid with a shared confidence. Somebody thought his sister would be an easy mark. Seems somebody hadn't been paying attention during the raid. Tilda. Knock yourselves out. Midoriya set down his bag against the wall and pulled his tie loose, placing it atop the bag before turning back to his opponent. Still standing in the middle of the room, the Kendo Club's vice president hadn't bothered to change anything before the fight, not that she had much. A long blue skirt that wasn't even part of their school's uniform, no tie, and her own kendo stick to tie the whole ensemble together. Fetching. Midoriya picked his own kendo stick off the ground and moved toward her, getting into his fighting stance only when he was in range to start fighting a few paces from the vice president. He might not know her name, but the least he could do is not point a stick at her the whole time he was here. So how are we going to do this? Midoriya mused over the rules, thinking over the fight he'd just walked in on. Contact. First to 3. Say when you lose. The vice president brought her stick up early into a guard, holding her sword in one hand and keeping it pointed at Midoriya all the while. And start when you're ready, I've got things to do. Midoriya nodded to himself, unbuttoning the top of his shirt before gripping his sword with both hands and anchoring himself in with his feet. Between the two siblings, while it was obvious that Fairy was good, the vice president had a bit more actual skill with her sword and that was what Midoriya wanted to put himself against. He wanted to go back against the showman, to really test his limits, and to try and find a way to beat that pretentious punk. But was it really pretentious if you could back it up? Midoriya rolled his shoulders to relieve the tension before locking eyes with his opponent and stepping in, drawing his sword back in one fluid motion before chopping down with his overhead strike. The move struck air as the VP took a more bladed stance, letting the sword pass right beside her while pulling her weapon back before springing out, probing Midoriya with a singular solid stab. Stepping sideways, Midoriya avoided it much like the VP had avoided his own first strike easily. This clearly wasn't very serious for either of them, just a way to test the opponent's guard before starting to fight more seriously, but tests like these could be very indicative of what was to come. For example, that dodge. Midoriya straightened himself out, stepping forward once again with another overhead strike. Again, the VP sidestepped the attack, but that's not how the showman would have done it. The showman would have let their swords meet, pushing Ronin's sword to the side to further disrupt the vigilante before launching an attack of his own. Pushing aside, Revenant grimaced to himself just remembering it as he stepped past another thrust, moving just far enough to let the stick sail by his arm instead of striking it. The push would have thrown Ronin off balance, not letting him step around the thrust like Revenant just did, and forcing him to block. Stepping around the attack seemed better, keeping your sword free and all, but the showman took the harder option for even greater results. He threw out a horizontal slash, creating a bit of distance as Kinky stepped out from his range then jumped back in for another thrust. He couldn't tell if she just liked thrusts or if it was all she could do, only bothering to fight one-handed. He met this one as the showman would have, stepping around the stab while dragging his sword up to meet the blade. A sharp tap as wood met wood, a brief engagement in the otherwise quiet fight. Midoriya held the power advantage, holding his sword with two hands, and could easily bat VP's sword to one side. Already dragging his sword up from his missed attack, he launched VP's sword skyward to try and throw her off balance. But as VP's sword went higher and higher, it suddenly turned backward and down as VP twisted her body, taking a step back as she pulled the sword into her body, quickly bringing the blade back under her control and it tipped back to her opponent. That was a good move that Revenant was pleasantly surprised to see. In a street fight with no rules, a sword was a lot more likely to get knocked around by cheaters, so a skill like that to quickly bring the blade back under your control was useful. He'd have to remember that. Having been put on the defense by her own attack, VP advanced again with two quick slashes from either side. A small rotation of the arm brought the sword tip around from the left, and a similar shift in the other direction likewise brought the sword rolling around into Midoriya's guard. Midoriya kept his sword up, using it again to block the first blow and pushing it back, then suddenly feeling off balance as the sword he was once striking against rotated around his blade and knocked it aside, turning his own force against him to get around his guard. While unbroken, his guard was now suddenly shifted far to one side by some seemingly light blows. While they didn't have the force to do any major damage, they had served as an excellent setup for what seemed the VP's specialty, stabs. Even as Midoriya realized what had happened, the VP pulled her sword in, stepping in to put power behind her blade before launching another sharp thrust. Midoriya only tried to bring his sword up for a moment before tossing that idea to the wind, his guard too far moved to be brought back in, shifting instead to shift his body out of the way. He turned his body against the attack, moving his cracked ribs out of the way to only be glanced by the thrust to his shoulder. Hit. The sharp jab moved Midoriya back a bit, putting his weight on his heels while he brought his sword up to defend against any follow-up thrusts, but the VP was content to make distance. He swung his shoulder back and forth, but the blow hadn't been serious even before he tried to defuse its force. He'd be fine. Midoriya moved in a small semicircle, moving around his opponent while trying to gauge the distance in her moves. He'd definitely chosen right, her fighting style far closer to the showman's than Fairy's, but the pace was very different. While Fairy captured the sudden and almost ballistic movements of the villain, the VP was a lot slower. Better for practice, at least. Midoriya steeled his grip on his sword and stepped into range, making no attack as he kept his eyes on his opponent's. No reaction. He kept his wrists straight as he stepped forward again, placing both of them firmly in each other's ranges while still making no attack. The tips of their swords hovered around each other, Midoriya's steady guard opposing the VP's swaying point. With one final step and a slight sway of the arms, blade met blade again. This time was much more quiet, with not as much distance or power to build up as sword met sword, both fighters eyeing each other over. VP finally replied, thrusting once along Midoriya's blade. Midoriya didn't even have to dodge this time, instead tilting his sword to the side and pushing the thrusting blade away from his body. Harmlessly it jabbed through the air, creating a slight breeze as it passed by his arm and left his opponent wide open. Midoriya gave one final push to his opponent's sword before throwing his sword up and across, striking her in the arm as she pulled back. There was no real force in the attack, too little distance for that, but he'd made contact and that was the first step. Now his opponent retreated slightly faster, eyes narrowing as she brought her sword in once again with a bit more speed than before. It seemed someone was starting to take this seriously. Not Midoriya, of course. Midoriya had no intention of putting real effort into his swordsmanship and was just here to experiment. That's why he led once again with a third overhead slash, an attack that his opponent had already read and beaten. One slight step and she snaked around his blade, moving forward and around it at the same time to close distance and attack herself. The thrust came out earlier, making it appear even faster as it launched towards Midoriya's body. But whatever it appeared, it wasn't faster. Midoriya pivoted around his sword again, deflecting the attack while backing off to create more distance. He wasn't really interested in testing his block, and even if he was, VP What's-Her-Face couldn't pull even half the stunts the showman could. So Midoriya attacked again. With no apparent thought behind his moves, he stepped back after his deflect and stepped forward for his attack, bringing his sword down in yet another overhead strike. The showman had parried many of his attacks, yes, but he also dodged quite a few as VP did, stepping to the side as his sword came down and then moving in for her own attack. If this attack was so easy to dodge, why the hell would anyone use it? Was there something he wasn't getting? VP stepped in for another attack before suddenly switching gears and stepping out further as Midoriya suddenly attacked again, lost in his own thought. He could repeat the attack as many times as he wanted, and had even practiced doing it dozens of times back to back for mindless violence, but what was the point if it never hit? In the same gap it took for him to raise his sword to swing again, any opponent worth a shit would just dodge again. Was that why he had to break their flow with a deflect first? By attacking while someone else attacked, or even right after, he could catch them off guard. Guarding while attacking was a lot more difficult than just attacking, and the split focus made guards a lot easier to break. Striking while someone was extending, like how he had hit VP after messing up her thrust. Midoriya was so lost in thought he barely even noticed that VP had gotten out of range after his third consecutive overhead strike, pulling back before lunging in with a fully extended thrust to strike him from just outside his range. To prove his point at least, Midoriya went on the offensive. Midoriya brought his sword front and center, blocking the thrust while stepping in to get into his own range. As he moved forward, VP stepped back, pulling her sword with her to prepare and then launch another stab. Midoriya barely had to try to deflect that one, his sword still in place from his last guard easily moving the few inches it took to bat aside the second thrust while continuing to close in. VP's blade still struck aside by Midoriya's defense. Midoriya finally decided to mix it up again and try to thrust of his own. He'd never really done one before, curved sword and all that, but it didn't seem too hard. Planting his lead foot down he leaned forward, keeping a solid grip on his sword to maintain power before jamming the tip into VP's stomach. Such an attack was still easy to dodge, going in a predictable and almost perfectly straight line, and even with her guard knocked around VP could still sidestep. Like Midoriya's first hit she could an entire slip away, but a small step and a little lean let Midoriya's weak thrust slide right off her stomach while she lined up her own thrust to show the vigilante how it was really done. Midoriya literally walked into her thrust, eating the entire thing and taking a proper blow to his stomach that sent the boy stumbling back, packing far more power with one hand than he had with two. Hit. Keeping her sword pointed at him, VP smiled, having the first proper win of the exchange. Both had hit each other, yes, and both were still even in how many times they'd hit each other, but it was clear by who was standing tall and who was trying to catch their breath that they were not on the same playing field right now. Of course, that didn't count for Midoriya doubling over and pulling back as fast as possible to dampen the blow or him acting like it hurt a lot more than it did. He just took out a dozen gangsters and went toe-to-toe with a villain, a stick poking him in the gut was nothing. Midoriya pulled himself upright, his previous injuries hurting more than that love tap, and resumed his guard. It hadn't been much, but still, the attack had hit him much to his surprise. It took usually at least 5 criminals working together for that to happen, but that might have less to do with VP's skill and more to do with the criminals' lack thereof. Pulled back into the moment by pain, Midoriya's next strokes were a lot better than before. He pushed off the ground to quickly close the distance while VP was still looking smug, going for a horizontal stroke to force some guarding. As the overhead strike could be dodged by moving to the side, the horizontal strike could be dodged by just moving under or over it. That being said, it was definitely easier to block than to jump 3 feet in the air or fall to your knees just to avoid one swing. VP took the middle of the road, doing a bit of both. Raising the tip of her sword into her first proper guard, she stepped back to catch just the tip of Midoriya's sword instead of the brunt of it, then slid around it while stepping in for her own attack. Sick of moving back and forth, Midoriya held his ground and held his grip on his sword, keeping it in contact with VP's and muscling her sword out of the way, throwing her off mid-attack and creating another opening. Just goes to show the showman knew a thing or two, this was getting results far better than just standing around or waddling back and forth while waiting for someone to fuck up. Taking advantage of the opening he created, Midoriya stepped in for a swing, bringing his sword high again as a thought struck him, so stupid it was probably genius. VP stepped aside as the sword rose, already used to seeing the overhead strike and moving out of its way, but even as she moved sideways she could see something was wrong as the sword that should have passed by her face never came. Instead, it hung for just a moment longer and whack. With a wicked crack the kendo stick struck VP across the brow, so slow it had slipped straight past her evasion. Shit, she swore, stumbling back and grabbing her face with her free hand. These weapons were made for practice, but without the proper protection equipment getting hit still hurt like hell. Infuriated, she glared through her fingers and pointed her sword accusingly at her foe. Taking advantage of the opening he created. It was so basic, such an obvious answer, that he'd probably never have thought of it. Revenant stared down at his sword, slowly processing the ramifications of his oversight, a mix of reflection and realization in his eyes. The showman had been able to attack so easily because he created openings, he didn't wait for them to come to him. Grabbing, thwack. Oh shit. There was the obvious concept of purposely disrupting someone's defense, but until now Midoriya never exactly grasped it. He could see it in his mind, he could recognize it, but it was like it just didn't click until this moment, like the difference between knowing and understanding. Midoriya's rapid-fire words came to a close as he smiled to himself, barely aware of his surroundings save for the extent of his sword. With his newfound knowledge he pressed forward, eager to demonstrate it in a practical sense. Kinky was having a rough time. From the moment the crafting kid challenged her something had felt off, but the longer it went the more obvious it became. She kept her sword in front of her, a deterrent to most opponents to back up, but the green blur had no such ideas as he charged in fast and swung even faster. What had started as a slow but random match became hectic as her opponent moved forward, holding his sword in 2 hands like her brother but hitting with a speed her short leader could only dream of. All she could do was barely keep up, trying to use her sword to ward off attacks. It came from above, from below, from the sides, and sometimes dead on as the boy rushed in. His legs themselves barely moved a steady stance that he built off of while his arms were worked hard to swing his sword circles around hers. Sideways slashes and crushing cuts knocked her sword around as Kinky was more concerned with keeping her feet under herself when her opponent lunged forward, pressing the attack while her sword was knocked aside. Seeing his entire body behind the attack, Kinky knew that she couldn't bring her sword up in time to try blocking that shit, so she did the only thing she could do and jumped to the side. Kinky jumped in the same direction her sword had been knocked, trying to bring it up to guard herself just as the boy's charge paused for a moment and changed direction for the third time this match. Even as she brought her arms up to try and block something, the sword moved in. The tip of the sword rammed into her arm, then skid off painfully to still hit her in the ribs, striking her once instead of twice through her terrible guard. At least it lessened the impact a little. Kinky stumbled back, still struggling to keep her feet under her, but her opponent wasn't done. He was never done. Already he moved in again, bringing his sword back in close to his body for another thrust, smiling at her all the while. It reminded her of when she first saw him. When she met the kid a few days ago, she thought she recognized him from somewhere. Maybe she'd just seen him around the school, maybe she'd pick a fight with him, who could really say? Thrust into overhead, horizontal into diagonal, and from diagonal back into horizontal. Now she knew, she'd definitely pick a fight with him. A long, long time ago. Wasn't it almost at the start of school? He crashed into her guard over and over, wearing it down with blow after blow. Some hits were aimed specifically for her sword, causing it sway to the side before she forced it back into position. Some were aimed for her gaps, striking at odd angles where she wasn't fully defended. Worst of all, some seemed to try ramming straight through her. Back when school had started she had been sent over to rough up the first years a little bit. Nothing major, just knock their class leaders around so they didn't think of starting shit with the kendo club. Judo club had done it too. Her graceful guard was gone, holding her sword with both hands in front of her. Hair hung in front of her face. Iron was in her mouth as her eyes focused on him. It had been so easy, just smacking the shit out of some punks even younger than her for all the matches. Then that last match. Then it. Savage Oni. The air seemed charged as he planted both his feet. His back stood tall, his head held high as he stared straight through the nothing in his way, slowly raising the sword high overhead. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back. You're going to say you won. The air had seemed charged as he planted both his feet. His back stood tall, his head held high as he stared straight through the nothing in his way, slowly raising the club high overhead. First form. Kinky could still remember the feeling as his back crashed into her ribs. The way he put his boot against the back of her skull when she was face down, the way he twisted and pulled her finger until it was about to tear out of its socket. She could see its eyes. It had a smile on its face that just barely reached its eyes as it stared straight through her, gripping its bat with both hands as it towered over her. She could barely even make out the words, its mouth barely moving to finish some strange sentence. Mindless violence. Boom. One foot came down, the arm snapped forward, the body twisted down and the dreadful bat swung down from on high, crashing into her like a thunderbolt, sending jolts of pain through everything. Boom. She tumbled back, her legs going weak from fear, but even gravity wasn't fast enough as it moved in, the monster closing the distance before twisting again. The dreadful club raised again. Boom. The impact seemed muted as it struck her across the face, the taste of iron mingling with her shortness of breath to cause the room to fade in and out. The floor felt gentle as she struck it, bouncing slightly along before coming to rest with her sword discarded to one side, eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling. She didn't know what she was doing, how to describe what she was feeling, or what just happened. As the second pressed on though, and the numbness passed, she did manage to think of one thing to describe how she felt. Quote. Ow. A small change in mindset, hell, not even a change. An adaptation in awareness was all it took for Midoriya to already feel the shifting of skill between his old self and the showman. Midoriya guided VP around their small court, leading her defense around by a string with small quick strokes. Midoriya had definitely created openings before, it was almost impossible that he hadn't, but he'd never been fully aware of it, like a child finally learning that while it could walk, it could also run. Quick but small strikes couldn't do major damage, especially in a fight against a delinquent who didn't even know kendo had a scoring system, but it could serve as bait to adjust her guard. Fast moves put her on the defensive even if they were too light to hurt, opening her guard for the real attacks with actual power behind them. Savage Oni. It wasn't just about pushing her guard around, it was about timing. Using his fast attacks to disrupt her and give time to build up to his larger attacks instead of just hoping he didn't get interrupted. First form. She held her sword in both hands as he said the words, barely aware of them himself. First, to prove his theorem. A light attack. Mindless violence. His body moved in a single fluid motion, pulling back on sheer power for speed as he brought his sword down with incredible haste. Twack. The two kendo swords met, clacking loudly as wood struck wood with VP forcing her sword against his, pushing as hard as she could to repel him, trying to force his sword back with sheer muscle. So, he let her. Suddenly his arm relaxed as he pulled back for his next attack, her sword suddenly flying forward as she broke her own guard. Her eyes widened as she pulled back, but it was too late. Thwack. The second hit struck her properly beyond her guard, striking her quickly across the cheek. Her body went limp for a moment as her mouth fell open, probably surprised by how light the blow had been. Yes, he had purposely pulled back on 2 attacks in a row. The small moment of pain as his stick struck her face took her completely by surprise, completely opening her guard as her sword dropped low. There would not be a third pulled strike. The sword came up as Ronin breathed in, grinning to himself in his small world as he raised his sword, completely in the flow. The world looked different in that moment. He knew exactly where he would strike, and he knew she wouldn't raise her sword in time to defend. It was like seeing a moment ahead of time, crystal clear. Everything seemed clear in his small world as he loosened up his arms, raising his sword directly overhead while finishing his breath in. The shot was lined up, her guard was down, and he was in position. All that was left was to take it. Ronin smiled as he stepped in, his entire body twisting as he put his everything into the final strike. His blade hummed as it split the air, a beautiful arc as it fell from on high and cut straight through his opponent. His sword struck his foe on her shoulder, bending hard as it crashed into and through her. Wood crashed against muscle and bone, but its impact went far deeper with the Ronin's first sword stroke. His foe fell back, legs giving out from under her to send her sprawled to the floor while Ronin stared at his sword, fit so naturally into his hands. This was exhilarating. This test at the kendo club had been far more impactful than he'd ever dared to dream. In fact, this whole event was only possible because they had such a solid spot of mediocrity. This girl, whatever her name was barely good enough to actually know how to fight while still being bad enough that he didn't have to fully try. A real fight, like the ones against the showman or the female Nomu, were great for gaining skill in hindsight. They didn't provide time to do that in the moment when every second was spent trying to survive the next attack, instead pushing his current skill to the limit, but a fight like this let him really think over his fighting style and develop it. This was great, a perfect middle ground for training purposes. It was everything he could have wanted and more. Midoriya smiled to himself, pulling his sword back up to face his opponent. He'd seen enough, he'd come far enough. Now it was time to throw the match. Midoriya squared up to his opponent, ready to pretend to lose to her next attack. To be confused when he couldn't find her, taking a moment to look around before finding her still on the floor, sword discarded to one side as she clutched her shoulder. Ow, ow, shit, well, shit indeed. Chapter end notes. Yo, sorry for the wait, had some stuff going on behind the scenes that tripped me up and had a rough coordination with my editor, but eventually timetables clicked and here we are. Glad to be back for a bit. The difficult thing about writing a manga about something is that you, the writer, have to know a lot about it. Now, you might or might not believe this, but I do not go out to regularly beat up criminals with a sword, so we're pretty far past my area of expertise. So my goal is to make Midoriya better at fighting, but he's already better than me. Where do ya go from there? If you're as dumb and desperate as me, you stick to your guns and rip things off even harder. Now, I might not strut the streets with a sword smacking suckers, but I do play video games, watch anime movies, and have access to the internet to get as many good ideals as you can steal as possible. This is all as a backdrop to explain Midoriya's newest revelation about fighting, creating his own opportunities to attack. While I'm sure Midoriya's done it before even in Ronin, it is something he could get better at and I thought a good step for that was realizing how important it was. For a comparison in my personal life, I've got a friend who's good at rock climbing, way better than me. And a very basic part of rock climbing is keeping all your limbs on the wall if they're not doing anything so you don't have anything just hanging off as dead weight. Everyone we climb with knows this, but this amigo just can't seem to remember it. He'll do it for a few seconds, then just leave his feet behind as he focuses everything on his arms making him fall off the wall to dangle and either swing up and recover or fall off. Stupid stories aside, knowing something and actually realizing it are a lot more detached from each other than I first realized. That created the idea of going back over some of the basics Midoriya learned forever ago and showing a more developed understanding of what they are, alongside how he can use them in fights. Hence the idea of creating openings as opposed to just using the openings he finds. There's a lot more ways to make openings than just flashbangs, and as some of y'all pointed out, Midoriya doesn't have infinite grenades. Pretty soon he's gonna be running low if not out, so something's gotta change. Talk is cool and all, but I intend to show this a little more in the upcoming fights. So, with my rants run down and my character limit getting close, time to call it a night. Thanks again for reading, now adios amigos. Oh, you literally forgot until after I posted, but man, what a great time to forget to hold back, Guess Midoriya's self-control isn't everything he thinks it is. Chapter 207, Done Dueling. Chapter Summary. Picking up during Midoriya's big oopsie last chapter, Midoriya's efforts to undermine his own hidden agenda. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. The rowdy kendo club grew quiet as the duel in its center grew hotter and hotter. Vice President Kinky had her usual stance, guarding gracefully with her sword pointing down her opponent, a force that had taken out many a gang that crossed Ishiyama's kendo club, but a gale that couldn't shake her current opponent. Her opponent kept his feet planted firmly as he fought the vice president. Nobody really knew who he was, just some kid from the crafting club most people in the school didn't know they had, but as he matched blades with the vice president it was clear there was something far past that. Fairy went from laughing on the sidelines to leaning forward as the battle continued, entranced. His baby sister was quick and strong, using her sword one-handed with similar force to most people using two. With sharp stabs and small steps to dodge, she could usually dance around her foe and stab them to death without ever being hit. Shit. But not this time. Her opponent stood firm and steady, literally knocking his opponent around the club. His sword crashed into Kinky's, knocking it aside before he stepped in for a real attack. The fight ended in 4 strikes. A lot of back and forth boiled down into 4 small strokes with the boy getting serious. 2 strikes met simultaneously between them, the crack of wood cutting the silence as the foes stared through each other. Both held their swords with 2 hands, but Kinky was just pushing against him. She wasn't even fighting back, she wasn't ready when the boy suddenly pulled back, bringing their impasse to a close as she stumbled a half step forward and he lined up his next attack. Efforts to guard were fast, but his sword faster as it whipped around and struck her across the face just past her guard. The tip of the blade ran across her cheek, stunning her for just a moment as the boy brought back his sword for one final strike. He didn't need to. The boy from the crafting club had already beaten Kinky's guard, and striking her face proved it. There was no way she could block his next attack, especially not when her mouth fell open and her eyes stayed locked ahead. She didn't even register that last hit yet, and she might never get a chance to. The guy from the crafting club pulled his sword far back, taking a single sharp breath in before locking eyes on his foe. Eyes like emerald fire burned through his target before he struck, a single fluid motion as he surged forward and brought his sword and foe low with one strike. Crack. Ow. Ow. The vice president collapsed to the ground, finally raising her voice again as she dropped her sword to grab her newly aching shoulder. Shit. Midoriya stared down at his opponent, mind still catching up to the present but moving quickly. Oh shit, he did that. In the Kendo Club, with lots of witnesses now was not the time to panic. Phew. Revenant slouched forward, dropping his own sword as his body heaved with large breaths. He was already sweating from the workout in the summer heat, but if he played this right. Did I win? The crowd looked on for a second, the quiet of the club lasting only a moment longer before breaking with the shouts of the delinquents. People surged forward, some clapping him on the back while others moved towards the VP, but the person who made the biggest impact was the smallest delinquent of all, Fairy's small hand creating a loud thump as it slammed into Midoriya's back. Nice. That was some good tricks there, kid. Fairy's words were as loud as his laugh, giving Midoriya a quick once-over before moving to the VP, sword still resting against his shoulder. And I thought you were crazy when you challenged me, but it looked like you might have learned a thing or two. Midoriya gave a small smile, pushing himself off the floor and keeping up his weak image. He didn't even respond as he looked down at his sword as he looked at the kendo stick in his hand. While his weakness was a facade, his surprise at the sword was genuine. To have such a one-sided victory, especially after the ego-bashing fight against that pompous stick in the warehouse, maybe he wasn't as weak as he thought. Keeping track of this was getting confusing. The confusion and the excitement of the duel was a flash in the pan, vibrant but over quickly as Midoriya excused himself with excuses of work to be done in his own club. He slid quickly from the club, exchanging one-liners and smiles with people who had been taking the piss out of him a few days ago, but it was no skin off his back. He learned two important things from his duel, as small as it was. First, a new technique, or a new way of looking at fighting that he was eager to try. Second, that he was eager to fight. Midoriya's small smile was wiped off quickly when he realized it, thinking over it. For the first time he could recall, he was genuinely excited to fight and to try out this new skill. Not just to practice it, but to experience the thrill again. The way he could control an opponent, the small movements, the rush, he looked forward to all of it. Midoriya ruminated over it, nodding his head a bit standing outside his classroom. The excitement was strange, a little foreign, but he could work with that. That small smile crept back across his face as he opened the door and walked into his class, giving Eiko a small wave before sitting down. Looked like he was gonna have some fun after crafting today. And I thought you were crazy when you challenged me, but it looked like you might have learned a thing or two. Fairy gave off a casual and uncaring air as he approached his sister, sprung out on the kendo floor like a throw rug, masking his real thoughts with a playful smile. Crouching over his sister, he looked at her shoulder with head cocked to one side. How ya feeling? His sister spoke through gritted teeth, working her shoulder in small circles. It's nothing, barely even a bruise. Fairy rolled his eyes, annoyed that his sister couldn't read the deeper meaning. He whispered to be a bit quieter, but the ferocity in his tone was more obvious. No shit, you get hit like every day. I meant how the fuck did that guy hit you? I don't know. Kinky peeled herself off the mat, working her arm back and forth to test it out and finding it still sore. Even if she could still move, that last hit would have opened her defenses and spelled her defeat. He's pretty good with his sword. Too good for a freshie, Fairy concluded as he helped his sister to her feet. You know anything about his background? Does he do kendo or some shit? Yeah, I know a little something. Kinky picked up her sword with her good arm, then looked at the retreating man of the hour. Start of the year, pecking order fight. He used a bat, but he beat the shit out of me. Didn't recognize him when he's acting so small. Acting small. Fairy and Kinky looked at his retreating form, trying and failing horrendously to slip out the front door. He kinda sucks at it. How'd you forget you kicked your ass for half a year? He did, Kinky almost shouted, quickly quieting herself but keeping on the intensity. He did not kick my ass. Yeah, and that guy is good at acting small. Fairy shrugged it off, barely remembering the time that he sparred with that guy. I'll win next time. Kinky refused to take it as a total loss, but Fairy had no idea if she even could have turned it around. While they seemed pretty even at the start, it was clear something happened in the middle, and if this wasn't the first time he beat her. Quote. So, you gonna try to bring him in full-time? Kinky spoke a little nervously, still maintaining eye contact on the kid from the crafting club, but Fairy dismissed it with a laugh and a slap on his sister's shoulder. Nah fam, nah, that guy don't wanna come right now. Let him cook, sis, let him cook. We got plenty of stuff to do right now anyway. Fairy smiled as usual as he stared at that crafting kid, but he couldn't help wondering how he would have done. If he fought that punk instead of Kinky, how would things have gone down? You bitch, that's the shoulder he hit. My bad, my ba. Bam. Ow, you bitch. Unaware of the machinations surrounding him, Midoriya and Eiko spent their lunch as usual. Sitting in the crafting club room, with a variety of papers and their lunches spread across the table. I think it looks good. Eiko compared the rough sketch in Hero Analysis number 14 to the boots sitting between their lunchboxes, turning the book sideways and pulling it forward while she squinted. I'm not sure if reusing all this old stuff from the last boots is a good idea though. Can't we get more? Is leather that expensive? The plans covered the conversion from Beowulf's current form into the next set of boots that Midoriya had made with Eiko's help, trying to use as much of the old boots as possible to not waste any possessed material. On top of that, he could still use the scraps from when he originally made Beowulf, but it was clear not everything could be made from possessed material this time. There just wasn't enough leather to go around. We've got some spare leather, but waste not one knot, or something. Besides, it's good practice. But explaining that he wanted to keep using the magic leather material to make his new armor for vigilantism was something Midoriya really didn't want to do to Eiko, so excuses. But looking at the stuff we need. Eiko and Midoriya compared what they had to what they'd need to upgrade his boots. They had the old boots, they had some spare possessed material, they had some normal materials, so all that was missing was odds and ends to literally pull everything together. The belt to hold everything together. Midoriya had envisioned for a while trying to use Beowulf to climb walls, but after his fight with the showman it was proved to be a lot more achievable than he first realized. So, hypothetically, if his grip was good enough, he could use the pull quirk in Beowulf to walk up walls. Then to make sure he didn't fall straight out of Beowulf while wall walking, he wanted to use belts to strap the boots securely to him. Problem was Midoriya had no idea how to make a belt like that. Didn't you say your dad might have one? Yup. Eiko tapped the sketchbook, running her finger along the drawing of Beowulf's new hypothetical belt. Something that could strap to his waist in the boots themselves, and possibly have a few extra pockets for some of the stuff the vigilante would be carrying. I asked him about it, but I'm not sure we'd have anything your size. Oh. Eiko's face lit up as she thought it over, coming to a sudden conclusion. Maybe you could come over and pick it yourself. You'd probably be able to adjust it a little, so if you come, we'll definitely be able to find one that you'd like. Sure. It was definitely the fastest way to get what he was looking for. Anytime good for you. We'll want my dad to be home, so today wouldn't be good. I think he's free tomorrow. I'll ask him. Eiko affirmed mostly to herself before pulling out her phone and sending Mao a text, while Midoriya was just surprised that Mao actually did things. Well, the guy probably had a job, but it was weird to think of the big guy doing something other than fighting. Yeah, tomorrow's perfect. We've got him for the whole morning. Alrighty, 9:00 clock. Eiko nodded as Midoriya made his plans. Between this and the Yakuza hunting he'd been planning for Saturday, this was going to be an interesting weekend alright. Eiko glanced down, noticing the time, and left with a quick bow and apology before sprinting back to class. Who knew if she'd ever realize that nobody else kept that close to the school's supposed schedule, but it'd probably be good for her once she left this shitshow of a school and entered the real world. Midoriya looked over his papers one last time, checking everything he needed against everything he had in his head. The leather, the sewing equipment, the thread, all that was missing to pull the next version of Beowulf was that belt, and he had no doubt Mao could deliver for the possible price of another free meal and the chance to knock the vigilante around under the pretenses of training. Midoriya laughed to himself as he moved his personal things to the side, making room for the Kendo Club's new swords. A score of bamboo sticks landed on the table as Midoriya switched gears to finishing their equipment, taking measurements and making cuts to form some swords for the destructive delinquents. It was monotonous, boring, but easy work that helped kill time while the boy waited for the evening. Few villains would be out yet, with 11 to about 5 being crime hero time, so there wasn't much point in going out to try and implement his new discoveries. If anything, it was more likely he ran into some hero and wound up running around the city trying to ditch them than actually finding any criminals to stop. So, he worked. His hands were steady and slow but made quick work of the wood and leather to reshape them into proper sparring swords for the Kendo Club. The brain-dead work also let his mind wander, and helped him to think over other small things he had to work around. Like UA and helping the students with their training. Tisk. Midoriya pulled a little too hard on the thread, almost snapping it, but quickly relaxed his grip to keep everything in one piece. He'd been so busy with his own stuff he'd all but forgotten about that, but it wasn't that big of a deal in hindsight. He'd just go to UA, finish the training he had come up with at the summer camp before everything went to shit, then he'd get his new helmet. Hell, maybe he could even get his new helmet before the training started. That'd be pretty good. In that case, he should probably head to UA early. Revenant checked his schedule on his phone, eyeing the approaching big day. It'd be a good show of faith to show up early and actually talk to the Ronin mastermind before the training, plus he could get help in implementing his training ideas. On the other hand, he'd have to talk to Nezu, and fuck Nezu. Midoriya sighed, coming to terms with the grim reality that not only was he going to go to UA, but he was also probably going to go early and willingly talk to Nezu. Well, semi-willingly. He stacked another completed sword into one of his duffel bags as the hours ticked by, thinking of times a little closer than the UA training. He had the details on a few chem labs for the Yakuza, the Shihisakai, but he'd want Mao's backup for that. He'd bring it up discreetly when he saw the big guy tomorrow. The few hours trickled by with Eiko returning, coming in quick to help finish the last of the swords. In just one more hour they were all done, the Kendo swords finished and stacked into the duffel bag. From there Midoriya could deliver the completed works to the Kendo Club come Monday morning since he didn't plan to swing by the school over the weekend. Another hour ticked by as the two went over Eiko's schoolwork for the day, a brief flurry of mathematics and grammar problems that were finally reaching the level of a real high schooler, or about 3 years past most of the kids in Ishiyama. After the effort leading up to midterms, Eiko no longer needed as much help with basic problems and instead used Midoriya to check her work before turning it in. It was quick work to check, and barely longer to correct, before he knew it they were all done with her papers. With a few plans made out for Saturday, Eiko and Midoriya made small talk before making tracks and going their separate ways. Eiko waved goodbye as she ran to the train while Midoriya ran in a circle, coming back to the crafting club. With the evening sunlight drifting in gently through the shutter shades, Midoriya moved through the quiet club, locking everything up. The Kendo Club swords, the paperwork, all of it got sorted into the cabinets and shelves until the whole club was clean and clear. Then he moved to the cabinet, removing the false bottom to pull out the last duffel bag, and set it on the table. He quickly unzipped the bag, checking if everything was in place, then the time. Just past 5, right when the heroes would be dying down and the crime would be picking up. Midoriya did one last check that everything was properly locked up before he removed his school clothes, folding everything neatly and setting it aside before getting into his other clothes. He pulled his bodysuit up around his legs, working them a bit to stretch the suit out across them before he put his arms in. He pulled his hands through, swinging them back and forth before a few shoulder shrugs to make sure everything was lined up, zipping the bodysuit shut. Loose pants pulled over the bodysuit, pulled tight to his frame by a belt. The pockets were quickly filled with various implements he might need in his work, like some of the spare throwing needles, first aid equipment, and good old pocket sand. He plucked his boots off the table, slipping each onto his legs before pulling them taut. A few testing steps in each before tucking his pants into them and tying them down, then taking a few steps back to the bag. A harness, with a pistol stored under each arm. One last adjustment to make sure the bodysuit's battery compartment wasn't covered by the leather straps before picking up the next item. An old jacket, torn and patched a dozen times, it was far too big for him even with the sleeves rolled up. But it did a hell of a job storing all his needles, bullets, and other paraphernalia. Pulling it across his back, he could find comfort in the gunpowder smell stained into the massive coat. Emptying the bag, out came 2 large arm pieces. First came the gloves, latching and plugging directly into his bodysuit. Then came the bracers, armor laid over top the wiring to protect from the dangers in the streets. Zipping the bag shut, he walked to his school bag and plucked a black bandana from the outside pocket, freshly cleaned and washed. You could hardly even see the bloodstains anymore. He ran the cloth between his claws, putting it on the table to tie back his hair before bringing the bandana over his face and tying it tight. Ronin stretched his neck, his breath causing the mask to flutter as he headed to the window, parting the curtains for a moment to stare into the sun setting behind the cityscape, the motion causing his weapons to sway and clink against each other. Quote. It's showtime. Chapter and notes. Yo, sorry this took so long. I got a new job and my editor forgot this chapter even existed, so it was sitting around in various stages of done for a while, but my time machine still only works in 1-second increments and takes 5 minutes to work, so no point in dwelling on that. More bad ideas ahead. Wanted to show the ramifications of Midoriya's showing off, plus tie it back to Midoriya's first showing off back at the start of the year, and who better to do that with than the person he beat the shit out of in the first place. Besides that, some quick moments with Eiko before another patrol chapter. She's definitely gotten easier to write with time, so hopefully I'm improving instead of making her more generic. I know that happens sometimes and I'm trying to avoid it, but if you see any signs feel free to shout them out so I can fix them real quick. Nothing's worse than inconsistent characterization, at least, not counting the million things that are worse than inconsistent characterization. Lastly, suit up montage cause I've seen Batman suiting up and was jealous, I mean inspired to write my own. Totally. It also doubles to show off the stuff he's packing, which gets mentioned offhandedly a lot of the time but can serve as a direct comparison to the heroes in Hero Aka. I always like the idea of costume evolutions and variations since, in theory, no costume is perfect. A costume can and sometimes has to adapt to its current circumstances, like Midoriya's missing mask being replaced by a cloth or his current belt just being a regular belt, compared to the utility-styled belts most heroes use. Midoriya doesn't get a lot of the conveniences professional heroes get, so finding ways to work around professional heroism and its rules is always fun. Sorry this chapter took so long again, but I think my ramblings delayed it enough. Adios amigos. Chapter 208, Ronin's Return. Chapter Summary. Ronin's semi-official return to the streets. Chapter notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. The sun was still sinking behind the cityscape when Ronin made his way back to the streets. Heels clicked against. The truck's left door creaked for a moment, straining against the brickwork it was encased in before the right burst open, the truck's driver falling out of the cabin directly onto the street. He propped himself up on shaky hands and knees, still rattled by the crash, coming to a stop at the feet of the two criminals keeping watch. The two criminals keeping watch barely even looked at each other, sharing a smile before the lead star's mouth began to glow red, a strange light shining through his teeth. It started soft but quickly grew harsh as the driver stumbled back, words caught in his throat. The two villains moved around him, one holding him in place while the other prepared to attack before interrupted by a strange sound, a wet breaking sound mixed with screams from back behind the truck. Crack. Monosh. Ah, chit, Monosh. The villains paused for a moment as they turned, their attention on the quick commotion just out of sight. Hesitantly, they glanced at each other, then moved forward around the truck's side towards the back. Ronin rounded the truck's corner, spotting two more criminals coming straight to him. They stepped back upon seeing him, startled and surprised while the vigilante stepped up. One of the criminals activated his quirk, stone encasing his hands and head as he roared, revving himself up before charging the vigilante. Ronin walked straight into him, his legs sweeping the villains while his hand grabbed the punk by the head and slammed him into the side of the truck, earning a scream of pain from the villain while he backed off and built distance. Stone rubbed his head, snarling as he pushed the pain down and lowered his guard in rage. He ran forward, coming at Ronin with fists swinging in massive arcs. The punches were big, they were heavy, and they were too slow to catch Ronin in his fancy footwork. As the villain moved forward, Ronin stepped back, swaying just out of reach of the punches to keep himself safe and keep his opponent in range. Should he let his opponent tire himself out? Should he interrupt the criminal's attack? Ronin was taking this a little slower than usual, trying to think through his movements when his thoughts were sidetracked by a glowing light from behind. Gotcha bitch. The villain behind him spoke through gritted teeth as he fired up his quirk, planting his feet for a steady stance and taking a deep breath while Ronin made up his mind. Ronin weaved past one final stone fist before crossing arms with the criminal, the heavy metal on his gauntlet skidding across the criminal's stone before smashing into his face. The metal studs cracked his helmet, turning his whole head sideways as his guard broke, giving Ronin just the opening he needed for some quick repositioning. As Lasers finally finished his big breath in and took aim, Ronin jumped into the stunned stone, kicking off him to launch one villain into the derailed truck while flying towards the other. Laser opened his mouth to fire his big laser as Ronin crossed the final feet between them, metal claws condensing into a fist to uppercut the punk, throwing his head up and back right before the laser could launch. From the criminal's mouth a stream of red energy burst forth, spewing into the sky like a firework for several seconds before harmlessly dying out over the city, vibrant red giving out to gray smoke. Shit. The criminal only had a moment to panic, his head pulled downward into another punch by Ronin, rocking his world as the vigilante's sharp left overtook his vision. Ronin pulled the criminal headfirst into his punches, holding him fast for 2 punches before letting him go on the third to collapse limply on the ground. Ronin loomed over his toppled figure, moving forward slowly while still surveying the surroundings. That looked like a rough fall, but he wasn't unconscious yet. He'd have to tie him up before checking him for any real injuries. Look out. Ronin twisted his entire body around for a spinning back kick into Stone's charging frame, his leg punching right past the villain's guard to strike the sneaking bastard before he could get in a surprise attack. The villain stumbled back, dropping the stolen box of cargo he had tried to bash over Ronin's head as he grabbed his stomach and tried to breathe. His face was flush, his eyes unfocused, and his body contorted, doubled over at the gut with everything focused. He hadn't been ready for that attack, and he wouldn't be ready for this one either. Ronin walked into the punk, scoffing under his breath as he grabbed the punk by his rocky head and then pushed him further down while spiking his knee into the punk's face. There was another wet snap as the little bitch's nose broke, throwing the criminal into more pain while blinding him to further attacks. Ronin grabbed the punk by his shirt, pulling him upright to slam him properly into the side of the truck. Ronin glared straight through the kid, pulling back his arm for a real punch, then stepped forward half a step. Bam! Slamming his fist into the side of the truck, right beside the scared punk's head. Ronin stared at the kid he pinned against the truck. He was sniveling, hands not even raised as tears ran down his face. His eyes weren't focused on the present, he was gone. Ronin looked from the kid to his own fist, to this sack of shit who helped throw an entire truck off the road to his fist stuck in the truck's dented metal. This kid was probably about to really fuck over the driver with Laser. If Ronin took just one more second to beat the shit out of that third patrolling criminal, he would have fucked that driver up far worse than what Ronin was about to do. Tisk. Ronin pried his fist free of the truck, forcing the criminal back against the truck before pushing him to his knees, only going for his makeshift handcuffs once he firmly had the criminal on the ground. Zip ties pulled the criminal's rocky arms together, tied off above the rock to make sure he couldn't slip free by deactivating his quirk. He pushed off the punk, moving from villain to villain with his zip ties in his left pocket and a first aid kit in his right. While the fight had been quick, it was good practice. It was going to be a long night, but with a single look at the truck driver and the confidence his counters gave him, Ronin could tell he wouldn't miss it for the world. The driver scooted back as the villains came close, hands scrapping the road as he backed off, but the villains were faster. They circled about him, grinning to each other before one held him in place, the other opening his mouth to fire his quirk. Crack. Monosh. Ah, chit, Monosh. The villains glanced at each other, shoving him to the side before making their way to the back of his truck and whatever the problem was. They circled around the back of the truck, peering forward when bam. He appeared. The hero quietly rounded the truck's corner, standing tall and proud while walking straight into the villains. One activated his quirk, his hands growing larger and gray before taking some swipes at the hero. His punches looked big, but against the hero's quick steps he just caught air, stumbling forward without even touching the nimble hero. Crack. In the blink of an eye the hero's fist was buried in the villain's face, stuck for just a moment before launching the villain back. The hero moved forward to the stumbling villain, jumping into the air and spinning about before hitting him with a wild spin kick and throwing himself backward. The hero launched off the first villain and straight into the second. The villain barely even had time to fire off his quirk, missing entirely as he fired straight into the sky before the hero pummeled him relentlessly, beating him down and into the ground before dropping him like a sack of bricks. But even as one villain fell, another rose. The first guy, the one with the weird arms, pushed himself off the ground and charged the hero from behind. The driver pushed himself off the ground, reaching out and shouting to the hero, "Look out." The hero reacted in an instant, spinning about to hit the charging fiend once more and send him reeling back. The hero pounced atop his mangled foe, beating the ruffian further and further back until, with one final loud punch that split the evening air, it was over. The driver sat on his haunches, stunned. He moved each villain he searched together, pulling them all around the truck before tying them to each other for good measure, and only after he took a step back to inspect the scene did he relax. With the threat of more possible attackers gone, and the authorities on their way, he was done. The police might have some questions for you, but they should be able to help you with your stuff. The hero gestured to the paraphernalia the villains had tried to steal, the boxes and crates pulled from the back of his truck, then glanced elsewhere in the city. "I'm afraid I have to get going though." "Why yeah, thanks again for the help, hero." The driver adjusted his hat as he laughed, catching a small roll of gauze for his hands from the hero on his way out. As he mulled over the tape, starting to wrap up his hands, he remembered something he should probably ask before the hero left. "Wait just a second." The hero had already begun to move to an alley, only taking a second to look over his shoulder at the elderly man. The driver cleared his throat, trying to rebuild his confidence and just getting it all out of the way. "What's your name, hero?" The hero stared at him for a moment, seeming a bit surprised before turning to partially face him. "Eraserhead." "Eraserhead." The driver mumbled to himself, taking the view of this Eraserhead fellow in. Well, by the way his whole body seemed protected except for his head, he must have some special kind of quirk. "You're a real something, Eraserhead. Good luck out there." The hero shook his head, chuckling softly to himself as he faced the alley and the dark streets of Muramasa's abandoned district once more, giving the driver a small wave goodbye on his way out before walking into the darkness. "You too." And as the sirens rang out in the distance, gradually growing louder as they drew on the smashed truck and its driver, Eraserhead vanished into the coming night. "I want your watch, not your life pal, but I won't hesitate." The gangster pinned his latest target to the wall with one arm, his forearm pressed against the man's throat while his cutter rested gently against the man's chest, the cold steel stinging against skin through the hole cut in the man's shirt. The man held his arm forward, offering to the gangster with a terrified expression, but the gangster made no move to dislodge himself. Grab the watch himself and risk giving his new pal a chance to escape. "Go on, ya got 2 hands and 1 good heart. You wanna keep both." His words trailed off as the knife was ever so slightly pushed forward, cold steel feeling almost burning hot as it pierced the man's skin. The man's white shirt was stained with a slowly blooming red stain as his breathing became harder. The man grabbed his wrist, fiddling with the watch and its straps, but it just wouldn't come undone. His hands shook something fierce as he pinched the sides of the clasp, tugging hard as his attacker leaned forward with a vicious smile, never overtaking his vision but dominating it. The knife slowly plunged further and further into his chest, his breathing becoming wild. Click. The watch finally came free, tossed aside like a venomous snake as the man leaned back against the wall, pressing his arms back as he tried to disappear into the brickwork with all focus on that knife, that terrifying shard of metal sticking in his chest, unaware that the watch never even hit the ground. The villain watched him toss the watch aside with a bemused smile, relieving the pressure off his victim with a calm. "See, that wasn't so hard. Now I got what I want, and you get to keep what's really important. A good lesson all around, I think." The villain stepped back, giving the man ample room to run while he grabbed his loot, content. With his third target done already, it had been a good night. Now, as the man's eyes flashed between the knife and him, seeming to stare straight through him, the villain laughed to himself. "I think you should get going, these streets are pee-pee." The villain took a second to realize there was something there, slowly turning in confusion. "What the foo?" Crack. A sharp snap as the figure behind him grabbed his outstretched arm, pulling him forward suddenly while ramming its elbow into his face. Against the certainty of steel his nose gave way, cracking to one side. Instantly tears flooded his eyes as he stumbled forward, trying to regain his balance by falling into his unseen opponent. He grabbed his face, clawing at his nose as the attacker's arm wrapped around the back of his head. Talons wrapped around the back of his head, throwing him down to kiss his opponent's knee. His head shot down, the knee shot up, and the night was broken by a pained scream as the villain was launched back. His knife arm was held fast by his attacker, keeping him standing flimsily like a puppet on a string while he clawed at his face in vain, trying to find a way to tear the agony off himself. Between the blood and tears running down his chin he couldn't see as the vigilante towered over his quivering form, hidden eyes glaring into him while its grip tightened on his arm. 15 hits in the last week. 6 people with lacerations. The rage in the voice was palpable as the vigilante kicked the criminal's leg out, forcing him to the ground while holding him aloft by his own arm. It was painful to be pushed so far back, earning another scream as the criminal twisted his body to relieve the pressure. Ronin had heard of this guy last week, but this was the first patrol he actually found the guy. Sure enough, if he looked over the right area for a long enough time, he'd find the right guy. Sure, he found a truck robbery instead about an hour back, but that wasn't a bad thing. If it's something worked, it worked, and he found a criminal reported about through the vigilante's web of connections. Minor cuts and stabs to the limbs, face, and chest. Minor, but dangerous. Ronin put more pressure on the criminal, pushing him down with his own arm while twisting it. If his judo was right, and it probably was, this seemed like a good submission hold. Hard to escape, requiring a tap-out to full get out of. But there were no tap-outs in the streets. You even impaled someone through the shoulder. Very dangerous indeed. The criminal refused to let go of his knife, twisting and writhing against the sidewalk while he screamed murder before the pressure let up for just a moment, refusing to even give an inch as he tried to throw off his attacker. He activated his quirk, his knife becoming longer and heavier in his hands as he roared at the hero. You think I'm some bitch? Think I'm just gonna give up like? He did. That report had made it into the news and put this guy on the hero's radar. Not that anyone was interested in a simple mugger, a crime with basically no recognition, even one who maimed a man. Whose hours were so late that few heroes would even have the chance to find him. To repay him. But you didn't stop. The snap as the shoulder joint was wrenched out of its socket was slow and sickening, earning a blood-curdling scream as the criminal reared back, opening his mouth and howling into the night. Ronin lifted the man one final time, pulling his dislocated arm across his body to grab the other arm. Forcing them together, he shoved the criminal to the ground, planting a boot on the small of his back to crush any more resistance, but still the criminal struggled even as the zip ties sectioned his arms together. His thrashing would only make the dislocation worse. Ronin stepped back, kicking the fallen knife aside as he surveyed the scene. The knife had finally fallen when he dislocated the man's shoulder, but even so, just because the criminal was tied up didn't mean it was all over. His head turned side to side as he took in the streets, the eyes hidden in the dark. He was not alone, but they were no threat. The homeless kept their distance, their eyes open, and their mouths shut as the vigilante took it all in. They had seen all, but they wouldn't have moved. They never did. He wouldn't have. Unsatisfying, but true. Ronin turned back to the last victim, appraising him as well. He had stayed standing, legs and arms pressed against the back wall, but his eyes were on Ronin. From the moment Ronin moved clear of the shadows, the man's eyes had been on him, but he was smart enough not to run his mouth to the criminal. Ronin reached into his coat, drawing out a small metal band. The glass glinted in the evening light, the early stars sparkling against the silvery metal in Ronin's claws. It really was a good watch. Can you get back to the main road? Ronin didn't approach the startled man, keeping his distance while the man regained his composure. He didn't speak a word, nodding fiercely while pushing against the wall. He'd probably run back as soon as he gained the strength, leaving his watch if someone didn't remind him. Catch. Ronin made a show of leaving himself, turning before throwing the watch to the man in a gentle arc. It bounced off the man's chest, the man scrambling quickly to grab the slippery silver before it hit the road, his attention finally on something besides Ronin. Check in with a police station for a report, and get those wounds looked at. The man took a second to finally and firmly hold the watch in both hands, breathing a sigh of relief. The watch back in his hands, the man looked up with a gentle smile, his grip tight on the antique. He raised his head to the hero who rescued him, mouth open, but the streets were dark and empty. Across the road he moved, the hero clad in a bland coat and drab armor. Over his shoulder he carried